I stood in my parents' kitchen on Thanksgiving surrounded by 10 guests and the smell of roasted turkey, when my mother handed me something that would change everything, a filthy mop still dripping with dirty water. "Since you're eating our food without contributing to this family," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you should at least earn your keep." My sister Heather laughed, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Come on, you're single and alone anyway. Cleaning is probably all you're good at." 10 faces stared at me. Some pitied, some smirked. None defended. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was who I really was. They had no idea I'd been paying their mortgage for 7 years. They didn't know about the $347,000 I'd quietly transferred to keep them afloat. They couldn't fathom that the government assistance program providing their health care was actually my company, or that I was the reason they still had a roof over their heads. But they were about to find out. That night, I walked out into the November snow with my suitcase and their laughter echoing behind me. By Monday morning, I'd canceled everything. By the end of the week, their comfortable life began to crumble. And when they finally discovered the truth about who had been holding their world together and who had been destroying it, the devastation was absolute. This is the story of how a Thanksgiving mop became a weapon of truth, how invisible love turned to calculated distance, and how the daughter they dismissed built an empire from their insults. And trust me, by the end you'll understand why that mop now hangs in a museum as a symbol of something they never saw coming. Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you breathless. My name is Lindsay Foster. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 12 years, I've built one of the most successful senior care companies in the Midwest. Most people don't know that about me, including my own family, who still think I'm just scraping by in some vague healthcare job they've never bothered to ask about. I suppose that tells you everything you need to know about where this story begins. The drive to my parents' house in rural Indiana took 3 hours through increasingly heavy snow, the kind of early November storm that arrives without warning and coats everything in a thick white silence. I gripped the steering wheel of my sensible sedan and watched the landscape transform from city to farmland, each mile carrying me further from the life I'd built and closer to the place where I'd always felt invisible. The GPS announced my arrival just as the sun began its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the Victorian farmhouse I'd helped renovate 5 years ago. I'd paid for the new roof, the updated electrical system, and the kitchen remodel, all presented as anonymous community assistance, because direct help from me was somehow shameful to accept, though they'd never questioned their good fortune. Heather's Mercedes was already parked in the circular driveway, taking up the spot closest to the front door. My sister had always had a talent for claiming the best of everything before anyone else arrived. I pulled in behind her husband's SUV and sat for a moment watching through the front windows as warm light spilled out onto the porch. I could see figures moving inside, hear the faint sounds of children's laughter. For just a second, I let myself imagine walking into that house and being greeted with genuine warmth, with questions about my life, with interest in who I'd become. Then, I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat and walked through the snow to the front door. My mother opened it before I could knock her face arranged in that particular expression I'd learned to read over 37 years, the one that said my presence was expected, but not necessarily welcomed. "Oh, Lindsay, you're here. Heather's been here since noon helping with preparations." The implied criticism hung in the air between us as I stepped into the familiar entryway. Heather's cream-colored cashmere coat hung prominently in the front closet draped over a padded hanger. I moved it aside to hang my practical wool jacket on the hook in the back where it wouldn't be seen from the living room. The house smelled like turkey and sage, like childhood memories that always felt just slightly out of reach, as if I were watching someone else's home videos. Heather appeared from the kitchen, perfectly put together in designer jeans and a silk blouse, her highlighted hair styled in loose waves that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Lindsay, you made it." She air-kissed near my cheek, her perfume expensive and cloying. "We were starting to worry the snow got you. The kids are playing upstairs and Mom's been telling us all about the cruise she and Dad are planning for spring." She linked her arm through mine in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt proprietary, leading me toward the living room where my father sat in his recliner already working on what appeared to be his second scotch. "There's the career woman," he said without getting up, his tone making my professional success sound like a character flaw. "Still married to your work, I assume?" Heather laughed, a practiced sound that made my jaw tighten. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers, setting it on the coffee table with more force than necessary. "Heather, dear, tell your father about Aruba. Lindsay, you can put your things in the basement guest room. We gave Heather and Tom the master since they have the children." The basement guest room. Of course. I carried my bag down the narrow stairs into the converted space that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times I'd offered to pay for proper waterproofing. The small heater in the corner rattled but produced minimal warmth. I could hear footsteps and voices above me, the sounds of a family gathering that I was technically part of, but never quite belonged to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking at my reflection in the small mirror over the dresser. When had I become so tired? When had I accepted that this was simply how things were? Upstairs cocktail hour had begun in earnest. My mother handed Heather a glass of wine in the Good Crystal, the set I'd given them for their 40th anniversary, though they'd thanked everyone collectively at the party without acknowledging my specific gift. When I emerged from the basement, my father poured my wine into a chipped ceramic mug with a faded tourist logo. "We're running low on the good glasses," my mother explained, though I could see at least 4 unused crystal glasses in the cabinet behind her. Heather settled onto the sofa like a queen holding court, her husband Tom beside her scrolling through his phone while she narrated their recent vacation to Aruba with the kind of detail that suggested she'd been rehearsing the story. The resort had these private beach cabanas and the kids absolutely loved snorkeling. Heather gushed, her voice carrying that particular pitch it always reached when she wanted attention. "Tom surprised me with a couples massage on our last day, didn't you, honey?" Tom grunted something affirmative without looking up. My mother leaned forward, rapt. "That sounds absolutely wonderful, sweetheart. You work so hard, you deserve these special experiences." My father nodded approvingly. "Nothing wrong with enjoying the fruits of your labor. Family vacations are important." No one asked me about my work. No one inquired about my life. I stood near the fireplace holding my chipped mug, watching this performance of family intimacy that somehow never included me as a full participant. The mantel caught my eye, crowded with silver-framed photographs documenting every milestone of Heather's life. Her wedding, both children's births, birthday parties, holiday gatherings, and there, near the end, a rectangular patch of slightly darker wallpaper where dust hadn't settled. A missing frame. I knew exactly which photo had been removed because I'd been looking at it for years, the only family portrait that included me taken at my college graduation. The only evidence that I'd once stood among them, smiling hopeful, believing I belonged. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through Heather's monologue about beachfront dining. "What happened to the graduation photo? It was right there." The room went silent. My mother's hand fluttered to her throat in that nervous gesture she'd perfected over the years. "Oh, that old thing, the frame broke. I've been meaning to replace it." Her eyes didn't meet mine. My father cleared his throat. "Heather, tell us more about that restaurant you mentioned. What was it called?" And just like that, I was erased from the conversation again. My question dismissed my absence from the family gallery, deemed less important than my sister's vacation details. Dinner preparation became another study in subtle hierarchies. While Heather sat at the kitchen table describing her children's private school achievements, the tuition for which I'd been secretly subsidizing for 2 years through scholarships, arranged via my company's charitable foundation, I moved between the stove and counter, checking the turkey stirring gravy mashing potatoes. My mother directed me with the kind of specific instructions usually reserved for hired help. "Lindsay, make sure you use the good serving platter for the turkey. And try not to tear the skin when you carve it. Presentation matters." When I carried the golden brown bird to the dining room table, my mother inspected it with a critical eye, her mouth pulling down at the corners. "Heather always carves it better. The slices are uneven, Lindsay, but I suppose it will have to do." My father, now on his third scotch, looked at the gathered family with the maudlin sentimentality of a man who's had just enough alcohol to feel emotional. "At least Heather gave us grandchildren to be thankful for," he said, raising his glass toward my sister. "Nothing more important than carrying on the family legacy." Heather beamed, accepting the praise as her due. Tom nodded along, still mostly focused on his phone. And I stood there serving spoon in hand, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not sadness anymore. Something else. Something that felt like clarity. The meal continued in its predictable pattern. Heather's children were praised for eating their vegetables. Tom's new promotion was toasted with the good wine. My mother's green bean casserole received multiple compliments. When I mentioned that I'd recently been featured in a business journal for innovative elder care practices, my father said, "That's nice, honey," and immediately turned to ask Heather about her holiday decorating plans. By the time we finished dessert, I had been reduced to a piece of furniture functional present, but not worth noticing. Then came the moment that changed everything. As I began clearing dishes, because of course I was the one clearing dishes while Heather supervised the children's bedtime, my mother disappeared into the basement. She returned carrying something that made my stomach drop, a filthy mop, the kind used for rough cleaning, its head gray with dried grime and still damp from whatever floor it had last touched. She walked directly to me past Heather, who had conveniently reappeared now that the work was done, and placed the mop handle in my hands like a ceremonial sword. "Since you're here eating our food without contributing much to this family," my mother announced, her voice loud enough to carry into the living room where my father and Tom sat watching football, "you should at least earn your keep." The words hung in the air, thick and ugly. I looked down at the mop in my hands, at the dirty water dripping onto my shoes, and then up at my mother's face. She wasn't smiling, but there was a satisfaction in her eyes, a settling of some long-held resentment that I'd never fully understood. Heather laughed, the sound sharp and deliberately cruel. "Come on, Mom, she's used to being single, and alone cleaning is probably all she's good at anyway." From the living room, I heard my father's low chuckle, Tom's snort of amusement. No one defended me. No one said, "That's too far." No one even looked uncomfortable. I stood in that kitchen holding a dirty mop while my family laughed at me, and something inside me didn't just break, it calcified into diamond-hard resolve. I looked at each of their faces, my mother's cold satisfaction, Heather's smirk, my father's indifference from his recliner, Tom's casual dismissal. And I understood with perfect clarity that I had been wrong about everything. I'd believed that if I was successful enough, generous enough, quiet enough, patient enough, they would eventually see my worth. But they never would. Because in their story, I was cast as the supporting character whose purpose was to make them look better by comparison. I set the mop down carefully against the counter, its dirty handle leaving a mark on the clean surface. I didn't say a word. I walked down to the basement guest room, packed my overnight bag with precise, methodical movements, and carried it up the stairs. My family had returned to their evening routines, my mother in the kitchen, Heather on her phone, my father and Tom with their football game. I walked past all of them, put on my practical wool coat from the back of the closet, and opened the front door to the November night. "Lindsay, where are you going?" my mother called from the kitchen, her voice more irritated than concerned. I turned back one last time, looking at the house I'd helped save, at the people I'd been supporting in ways they couldn't imagine, at the family that had just handed me a mop to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. "I'm going home," I said quietly. And then I walked out into the snow, my footsteps the only sound in the crystalline air, leaving behind their laughter and their certainty that I would always come back, always forgive, always be available to be diminished. That night I packed my suitcase in silence, walked out into the November snow, and left their laughter behind, knowing they had no idea who I really was. I drove for 20 minutes before the shaking in my hands became too severe to safely continue. The budget hotel appeared like a beacon off the highway, its neon vacancy sign cutting through the falling snow with an almost desperate brightness. I pulled into the parking lot, registered at the front desk with a clerk who barely looked up from his phone, and carried my overnight bag to a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and other people's transient lives. The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly I was alone in a way I hadn't been in years, truly alone without the weight of expectation or the performance of being the disappointing daughter. I sat on the edge of the bed, my coat still on, and felt something break loose inside my chest. The crying started quietly, almost politely, the way I'd trained myself to cry over the years so no one would hear. But then it became something else entirely. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away since childhood. I cried for tonight. Yes, for the humiliation of standing in that kitchen holding a dirty mop while my family laughed. But I also cried for my 16th birthday when they forgot completely too focused on Heather's college application essays. I cried for my business school graduation when neither parent attended because it conflicted with Heather's daughter's dance recital. I cried for every Christmas where my carefully chosen gifts were opened with polite disinterest while Heather's generic gift cards were praised as thoughtful. I cried for the little girl who'd tried so hard to earn love that should have been given freely, and for the woman who'd finally understood it never would be. When the tears finally subsided, I felt hollowed out but strangely clear-headed. I opened my laptop with hands that had stopped shaking and logged into my banking app, something I did every morning as part of my routine, but had never looked at quite this way before. The automatic payments were listed in neat rows, each one a small piece of the invisible architecture I'd built around my family's life. Mortgage payment to First Federal Bank, $400 on the first of every month for the past 7 years. Property tax payment to Hendricks County, $200 quarterly. Car payment for a Buick registered in my father's name, $380 monthly. Health insurance premiums for my mother's supplemental Medicare plan, $425 monthly, because her prescriptions were expensive and their base coverage inadequate. And there, buried at the middle of the list, a payment I'd almost forgotten about, $1,200 monthly to Riverside Academy, the private school where Heather's children attended, processed through a community scholarship fund that existed only on paper. I opened a spreadsheet and started calculating. 7 years of mortgage payments, 7 years of property taxes, 5 years of car payments before this current vehicle, 6 years of insurance premiums, 3 years of school tuition. The number that appeared at the bottom of my calculations made me physically dizzy, $347,000. $347,000 I had quietly, invisibly transferred from my accounts to theirs, structured through various channels, so they'd never know it was me. They thought they'd been approved for government assistance programs, community support initiatives, anonymous charitable grants. They'd accepted every dollar with the satisfied entitlement of people who believed they deserved good fortune, never once wondering who their mysterious benefactor might be. Not once in 7 years had they said thank you, because they'd never known there was someone to thank. And tonight, they'd handed me a mop. Sleep was impossible. At midnight, I gave up pretending and retrieved the old photo album from my car, the one I kept in the trunk like a secret I was ashamed of wanting. I'd started it years ago as a way to document that I had once belonged to these people, that there was photographic evidence of my membership in the foster family. The album was thin because there weren't many pictures of me to collect. But there was one I'd saved, one I'd never shown anyone because the story behind it was too painful to tell. I opened to the page where I'd pressed the ruined photograph between sheets of protective plastic. The family portrait from my college graduation, taken on the steps of the administration building by a professional photographer my parents had hired. In the photograph, you could see 4 people, my mother and father in the center. Heather to my father's right and to my mother's left, a headless body in a blue graduation gown. My face had been carefully, deliberately cut away in a clean oval, the kind of precise removal that required scissors and intention. I'd found this photo 3 years ago in their trash can when I'd stayed over to help my father recover from knee surgery. I'd been taking out the garbage and seen it lying on top of the other refuse. And I'd stood there in their driveway understanding that someone had looked at this image of their family and decided my face didn't belong in it. I'd kept it anyway as a reminder of something, though I'd never been quite sure what. A reminder to try harder, maybe. A reminder that I needed to earn my place. But sitting in that hotel room at 1 a.m, I finally understood what it really was evidence. Proof that I hadn't imagined the erasure, the deliberate diminishment. They had literally cut me out of the family portrait, and I'd spent years trying to prove I deserved to be cut back in. I picked up my phone and texted Marcus, my assistant at Iron Leaf Care Group. He was a night owl, probably still awake, working on the quarterly reports. Cancel all family-related accounts effective immediately. No warnings. His response came within seconds. Are you sure this is a big step? I typed back. I'm sure. First thing Monday morning. Every automatic payment, every subsidy, every anonymous grant. End all of it. Then I blocked my parents' numbers, blocked Heather's number, and blocked Tom's number for good measure. My contact list suddenly looked much smaller. The liberation I felt was terrifying in its intensity. For 7 years I'd been tethered to them through these invisible financial threads, believing that if I just supported them enough, sacrificed enough, stayed quiet enough, they would eventually see me. But they never would, because they'd never looked in the first place. At 3 a.m, I opened my laptop and began writing an email. Dear Mom, Dad and Heather. It started, and then I poured out everything, every payment, every sacrifice, every moment of being overlooked while I kept their lives comfortable. I wrote about the mortgage and the insurance and the property taxes. I wrote about Heather's children's school tuition and the car payments and the medical bills. I detailed every single dollar of that $347,000 and explained exactly how their community assistants had actually been their dismissed daughter, holding everything together from the shadows. When I finished, the email was 4 pages long and felt like bleeding onto the screen. Then I deleted it. They didn't deserve an explanation. They deserved to face consequences without understanding their origin, to feel the foundation crumble without knowing what had been holding it up. I opened a different browser tab and searched for furnished apartments, finding a small 1-bedroom across town available for immediate occupancy. I filled out the application right there at 3:30 in the morning, submitted first and last month's rent via electronic transfer, and received an approval email before dawn. As gray November light began filtering through the hotel curtains, I opened my journal, the leather-bound one I'd been keeping since I started my business, full of goals and gratitudes and careful professional observations. On a fresh page, I wrote a single paragraph. They gave me a mop to remind me of my place. They wanted me to understand that in their hierarchy, I exist to serve. What they don't understand is that I've been holding up their entire world while they treated me like the help. I'm about to show them what happens when the foundation walks away. Not with anger, not with drama, just with absence. By Monday morning, their comfortable life would begin to crumble, and they wouldn't understand why. By Monday morning, their comfortable life would begin to crumble, and they wouldn't understand why. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp winter clarity that makes everything seem more real, more consequential. I drove through downtown Indianapolis as the city woke up around me, watching office workers hurry through the cold, clutching their coffee cups, and felt something settle in my chest that might have been resolve or might have been grief. The glass and steel tower that housed Iron Leaf Care Group reflected the morning sun like a beacon. And as I pulled into my reserved parking space, I allowed myself a moment to remember the woman I'd been 12 years ago, when this company was nothing more than an idea and a desperate need to prove I could build something meaningful. Back then, I had one elderly client, Mrs. Patterson, who needed help with grocery shopping and meal preparation. I'd driven her around in my used Honda, charging barely enough to cover gas, learning the business one conversation at a time. Now that tower represented 247 employees, 200 families across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, and a reputation for excellence that had taken over a decade to build. Marcus met me at the elevator, his usually composed face showing unusual concern. In the 3 years he'd worked as my executive assistant, he'd never seen me miss a day of work. Never seen me arrive looking like I'd spent the weekend in a hotel room processing a lifetime of family dysfunction. He handed me my schedule tablet without comment, but his eyes asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, I said something that made him pause mid-stride. I need a complete list of all clients in Hendricks County, particularly anyone enrolled in our community assistance programs. Full files, care notes, financial structures. He started to ask why the word forming on his lips, but something in my expression stopped him. "It's time for an audit," I said simply, and walked into my corner office where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Monument Circle. I'd stood at these windows 1,000 times, but today the view felt different, sharper somehow, as if walking away from my family had cleared my vision of obstacles I hadn't realized were there. The morning meeting with Sandra, my CFO, was supposed to focus on fourth-quarter projections, but I redirected the conversation to Project Dignity, our initiative that provided free in-home care to qualified seniors who fell through the cracks of insurance coverage and government programs. Sandra pulled up the spreadsheet and I scrolled through the client list with clinical detachment until I reached number 847. Foster William and Margaret enrolled 3 years ago through our third-party coordinator system, specifically designed to maintain donor anonymity. I'd structured it that way intentionally, routing the funding through enough channels that my parents would never trace the help back to me. The file was extensive bi-weekly nurse visits for blood pressure monitoring and medication management, weekly aid services for light housekeeping, and meal preparation, quarterly wellness checks. I opened the care workers' notes, and there they were. My parents' voices preserved in casual comments, documented by well-meaning nurses who had no idea whose parents they were serving. Mrs. Foster mentioned again how blessed they are to have this government program, one note read. Another, Mr. Foster said they must have done something right in life to deserve this help. Very grateful today. The most recent entry dated just 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Foster commented that they're not like some families whose ungrateful children abandon them. They said their family takes care of each other. I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest as I read those words. They'd accepted my care while standing in their clean house, their health monitored, their medications managed, and somehow convinced themselves they deserved it through their own virtue, while simultaneously handing me a mop and telling me to earn my keep. I closed the file and looked at Sandra, who was watching me with the careful expression of someone who senses they're witnessing something significant. Client 847, I said clearly. Terminate services immediately. No explanation required. Just a standard letter saying their enrollment period has concluded. That afternoon brought an unexpected respite from the weight of my decisions. I attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a women's shelter on the East Side, a facility I'd funded through an anonymous donation structured through my charitable foundation. The mayor stood at the podium praising the mysterious benefactor who'd contributed $500,000, and I stood in the back of the crowd wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, watching women who'd escaped impossible situations tour their new safe haven. An elderly woman approached me as the crowd dispersed, her face breaking into recognition despite my attempt at anonymity. Mrs. Chen had been one of my earliest clients, a woman trapped in an abusive marriage who I'd helped relocate 5 years ago, connecting her with legal services and temporary housing until she could rebuild her life. She took my hand in both of hers and whispered, "I know it was you who saved me. I know it's you who keeps saving people." Her eyes filled with tears. "You save people who've given up on themselves." I hugged her, this woman who was essentially a stranger, but who saw my value more clearly than my own parents ever had. As I drove back to my office, I thought about the bitter irony my family believed I'd accomplished nothing worth mentioning, while I'd literally transformed thousands of lives they would never know about. That evening, my phone rang Mom's number. I let it go to voicemail and waited to hear what a life without my safety net sounded like. The voicemail notification appeared on my phone screen like a small red badge of consequences. I was in my office reviewing care protocols when it buzzed, and I watched my mother's name appear with something approaching clinical curiosity. I let it ring through to voicemail. then waited the appropriate 30 seconds before playing the message on speaker. Her voice came through tight and confused, with an edge of irritation that suggested she believed this was somehow my fault without yet understanding how. "Lindsay, there's been some mistake with our bank account. Several automatic payments have been declined, and I'm getting notices about overdraft fees. Call me back as soon as you get this." I saved the message in a folder I'd created specifically for this purpose, labeled simply "Evidence," and returned to my work. The next day brought another message, this time from my father, and his tone had shifted from irritation to genuine alarm. "This is serious, Lindsay. The mortgage company called saying we're overdue. I don't understand what's happening. We've never missed a payment in 7 years, and suddenly they're saying we're 30 days past due and threatening late fees. Call me back." "This isn't funny." I listened to his voice crack slightly on the word "serious," and felt nothing except a distant recognition that the machine I'd built was functioning exactly as designed. When you remove a foundation, the structure doesn't collapse immediately. It shifts, settles, cracks along invisible fault lines, and the people inside feel the instability before they understand its source. Heather's message arrived on day 3, and unlike our parents, she didn't bother with confusion or requests for help. Her voice was pure accusation, sharp with a panic I'd never heard from her before. "Where the hell are you? Mom and Dad are freaking out about money, and you've disappeared like some kind of ghost. Whatever game you're playing, whatever point you're trying to make about Thanksgiving, just stop it. This is serious. People are going to get hurt." I played that message twice, fascinated by her choice of words. People are going to get hurt, as if consequences were something that happened to victims rather than something earned through years of cruelty and exploitation. I saved her message with the others and made no attempt to respond to any of them. But Heather's mention of the mortgage had planted a question I couldn't ignore. My parents' house had been nearly paid off when I started managing their finances 7 years ago, with only about $60,000 remaining on the original loan. The monthly payment of $2,400 I'd been covering should have cleared that debt years ago. I called Janet Reeves at First Federal Bank, the loan officer who'd worked with me when I first set up my parents' financial management structure. Janet and I had a professional relationship built on 7 years of reliable payments and transparent communication, so when I asked her to pull up the current mortgage status for the Foster property, she didn't hesitate. What she told me made the room feel suddenly cold, despite the afternoon sun streaming through my office windows. 6 months ago, someone had refinanced the house, taking out a new mortgage for $180,000 against a property valued at $280,000. The original $60,000 remaining had been paid off, which meant someone had extracted $120,000 in cash from my parents' home equity. Janet walked me through the paperwork, and I felt my jaw tighten as she described the disbursement. The funds had been transferred to an account under Heather's name at a different bank. The signature on the refinancing documents was supposedly my father's, but even over the phone, as Janet described the shaky, inconsistent handwriting, I knew it was a forgery. My parents, who believed they were nearly mortgage-free and secure in their retirement, now owed more on their house than they had in 15 years. Janet's voice took on a careful, professional tone as she asked the question I'd been expecting. "Lindsay, given your role as their financial consultant and the irregular nature of this refinancing, do you want me to flag this for a fraud investigation? The signatures don't match our records, and the disbursement pattern is highly unusual." I sat at my desk, looking out at Monument Circle, where people went about their ordinary Monday lives, and considered the weight of that decision. I could destroy Heather with a single word. One fraud investigation would unravel everything she'd done, potentially landing her in prison and certainly ruining whatever remained of her life. But that felt too easy, too quick, too much like the kind of immediate vengeance that would leave me empty. "Not yet," I told Janet quietly. "Let me handle it internally first, but document everything, please. I may need those records later." That night, I did something I'd promised myself I wouldn't do, something that felt like crossing a line, even though technically I had every legal right to do it. I logged into my parents' financial accounts using the passwords I'd set up years ago when my father had knee surgery and asked me to temporarily manage their bills. Temporarily had become 7 years of invisible financial management, and I'd never changed the access credentials because some part of me had always known I might need to see the truth someday. What I found as I scrolled through months of transactions made my hands shake with a rage I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment. Heather had been systematically bleeding them dry for years. There was a $15,000 loan marked as a business investment for a boutique that never materialized. Monthly charges labeled storage rental for $500 supposedly for keeping items in their basement, except I'd been in that basement and there was nothing of Heather's stored there. Grocery charges on their credit card nearly every week, always with Heather's signature, always with a note in my mother's handwriting saying, H picked up items for us. But I cross-referenced the dates with my parents' calendar, and half those charges occurred when they were out of town. Even smaller things jumped out at me: gas station charges on their card, restaurant meals, online shopping purchases shipped to Heather's address. The total over 5 years, when I finally finished calculating in a spreadsheet that made me feel sick, came to nearly $200,000. $200,000 that Heather had extracted from our parents through manipulation, forgery, and lies, while I had quietly deposited $347,000 to keep them afloat. I was the foundation holding up the house while my sister was termites eating it from the inside. And somehow in their eyes, I was the disappointing daughter who contributed nothing, while Heather was the devoted child who visited regularly and brought the grandchildren over for Sunday dinners. I finally understood I wasn't their failure. I was their fortune. And it was time to let them face the truth about who had been saving them and who had been destroying them. The week following my discovery of Heather's theft, I moved through my office like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, each action deliberate and precise. I had Marcus compile a list of every financial institution where I maintained my parents' accounts as an authorized payer, every utility company where I'd set up automatic transfers, every insurance provider where I'd been covering premiums. They didn't know I was paying. The list filled 2 pages, single-spaced a comprehensive map of the invisible support system I'd constructed over 7 years. Then I began the process of dismantling it piece by careful piece. The certified letters went out on a Tuesday morning, each one typed on plain white paper with no letterhead, no identifying information beyond a return address that led to a registered agent service I'd hired specifically for this purpose. To First Federal Bank, to State Farm Insurance, to Indianapolis Power and Light, to AT&T, to the county tax assessor's office. Each letter contained the same carefully worded message: your Community Assistance Program enrollment will conclude on December 31st. Please make arrangements for regular payments beginning January 1st. Thank you for your participation in this pilot program. I signed them Community Care Coordinator in a generic typed signature, deliberately vague, deliberately mysterious. I didn't want to cut them off immediately because that felt both cruel and potentially legally complicated. But I wanted them to have exactly 1 month to panic, to wonder, to try desperately to understand where their safety net had come from and why it was being removed. 1 month to feel the ground shifting beneath their feet before it disappeared entirely. On that same Tuesday, I walked into the Indianapolis Metro Police Department downtown headquarters and asked to speak with someone about filing a voluntary absence notification. The desk sergeant looked puzzled until I explained what I needed, then directed me to a female officer in her 50s, whose nameplate read, Detective Sarah Morrison. I sat across from her in a small interview room and explained my situation with the clinical detachment I'd perfected over the past week. I'm estranging myself from a toxic family situation, I told her. I want to ensure that if they report me as a missing person, there's a record that I've chosen to limit contact and am not in danger. Detective Morrison studied me for a long moment, her eyes kind but knowing, and then she nodded slowly. I wish more people knew they could do this, she said as she typed up the formal notification. Too many people feel trapped by family obligation even when that family is destroying them. She had me sign the document, gave me a case number, and told me that if anyone filed a missing person report on me, they'd be informed I was voluntarily absent and safe. Walking out of that police station, I felt another thread connecting me to my family snap cleanly. That afternoon, I deactivated every personal social media account I maintained, changed my cell phone number to one that only Marcus and my attorney Eleanor Park would have, and updated all my emergency contact information to remove my parents and sister entirely. My digital footprint, at least the personal one, simply ceased to exist. When my family tried to reach me now, they would encounter only silence. The same profound silence I'd faced every time I'd needed them emotionally, and found nothing but dismissal and indifference. By mid-December, Marcus started receiving calls, and I knew the story had begun spreading through my parents' small town, the way stories do in places where everyone knows everyone else's business. Mrs. Henderson called first the neighbor who'd lived next door to my parents for 20 years, and who'd been one of Ironleaf Care Group's early clients when her husband developed dementia. Marcus, following the script we'd prepared, told her calmly, "Ms. Foster is safe and taking personal time. She's asked not to be contacted by family members." There was a long pause, and then Mrs. Henderson's voice came through warm with understanding. "Good for her," she said quietly. "I saw what happened at Thanksgiving through my kitchen window. Those people never deserved her." Marcus relayed this conversation to me, and I felt a strange validation, knowing that at least one person had witnessed my humiliation and recognized it for what it was. The gossip spread with the efficiency of small-town communication networks. Marcus reported more calls, more inquiries, and through his careful responses, I could trace the narrative forming, "The foster daughter, you know, the successful one they never talk about, has vanished." Apparently, there was some incident at Thanksgiving. I had become a ghost, haunting my family's reputation, present in every conversation about them, but absent from their lives, a mystery they couldn't solve because solving it would require them to acknowledge how badly they'd treated me. I'd disappeared from their lives, but I hadn't gone far. I'd rented a small apartment just 3 miles away, close enough to watch their world fall apart. Mrs. Henderson and I established our routine in the second week of December, meeting every Wednesday morning at a diner called Martha's Place, located exactly halfway between my new apartment and my parents' town. She would arrive first, always ordering black coffee and wheat toast, and I would slide into the booth across from her, feeling like a spy gathering intelligence on a life I'd once been part of. Mrs. Henderson had known me since I was 7 years old, had watched me grow up in the shadow of Heather's spotlight, and she'd been quietly disgusted by my family's treatment of me for years. Now, at 74, she'd become my eyes and ears in a community I'd left behind but couldn't quite stop watching. Her first report came with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Your father was on the front porch yesterday arguing with someone from the mortgage company," she told me, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. Loud enough that half the block could hear. He kept saying there must be some mistake, that the payments have always been automatic. She paused, watching my face for reaction. "Your mother's flower garden is dying. All those roses she was so proud of are turning brown." I finally realized she wasn't taking care of them herself, someone else was. I nodded, remembering the lawn service I'd hired 3 years ago, another invisible support beam now removed. The updates continued, each one a small wound that I told myself I didn't feel. Heather's Mercedes disappeared from their driveway at 6 in the morning on a Thursday, repossessed, while neighbors watched from their windows and pretended they weren't watching. Mrs. Henderson reported this with undisguised pleasure. "The repo truck woke up half the street. Heather came running out in her bathrobe screaming about a mistake, but they had all the paperwork. Took the car right in front of God and everybody." I also created a fake Facebook profile under the name Sarah Mitchell and joined the Hendricks County Community Group, where townspeople posted everything from lost dogs to pointed gossip about their neighbors. The discussions about my family were fascinating in their division. Some posts called me ungrateful. "I heard the foster daughter just abandoned her elderly parents right before Christmas. What kind of person does that?" But increasingly, other voices pushed back with questions that made my chest tight. Where was this family when Lindsay was building her company? I've never heard them mention her accomplishments. My sister uses Iron Leaf Care Group and says Lindsay Foster is basically a saint. Maybe there's more to this story. I watched these debates unfold from my apartment, a ghost observing people argue about my character without knowing I could see every word. But surveillance from a distance wasn't enough. On a Tuesday night in mid-December, I found myself driving past my parents' house at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, unable to stop wondering if I'd gone too far. The living room lights were on, and through the front window I could see my father pacing back and forth, a gesture I recognized from childhood whenever he was worried about money. He was probably reviewing bills, trying to understand what had happened to their comfortable life, and part of me wanted to walk through that door and fix everything the way I always had. I sat in my car across the street for nearly an hour, watching him pace, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility, mixed with something newer and more painful. The recognition that saving them again would mean sacrificing myself again. I'd started seeing a therapist the week after Thanksgiving, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wells, who specialized in family trauma, and whose office had a view of a small garden that somehow made painful conversations easier to bear. During our third session, I broke down completely, the careful control I'd maintained finally cracking. "What if I'm being cruel?" I asked through tears that surprised me with their intensity. "What if I'm becoming exactly like them, cold and withholding and punishing?" Dr. Wells leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Lindsay, you're not withholding love. You're withdrawing from exploitation. Those are fundamentally different things. Love should be reciprocal. What you had with your family was a one-way transaction where you gave everything and they took everything, and when you finally stopped giving, they couldn't even see you clearly enough to understand what they'd lost." Her words helped, but they didn't stop me from checking the Iron Leaf Care Group emergency line every night before bed, terrified I'd hear that something terrible had happened to them, and I'd have to live with the knowledge that I could have prevented it. Mrs. Henderson's report in the third week of December carried a new gravity that made my coffee taste like metal. "Your mother's been complaining about chest pains," she said quietly, her weathered hands wrapped around her mug. "I heard her mention it to Ruth Patterson at the pharmacy, but she's refusing to see a doctor. Said something about not being able to afford the copay now that her good insurance lapsed." I felt my stomach drop, knowing that premium insurance had been one of my payments, knowing my mother's heart condition was documented and serious. Mrs. Henderson continued, "And Heather hasn't been around at all. Your mother made some excuse about her being busy with Christmas preparations, but everyone knows she's avoiding them now that the money's gone." Then she delivered the detail that broke something in me despite all my resolve. "Your father took a job at Morrison's Hardware. I saw him there yesterday wearing a name tag stocking shelves. He's 68 years old, Lindsay. He looked so tired." The image of my proud father, the man who'd dismissed my achievements and laughed when I was handed a mop, now wearing a retail name tag and lifting boxes at an age when he should have been comfortably retired, hit me harder than I'd expected. I called Marcus from the diner parking lot, my hands shaking as I held the phone. "Get me the complete financial picture on my parents. Everything. I need to know exactly how bad it is." The report arrived the next morning in a sealed envelope, and reading it felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. They were 3 weeks from foreclosure, with the bank already preparing the legal paperwork. Their credit cards were maxed out at a combined total of $42,000, most of which I now knew represented Heather's theft disguised as family help. They had exactly $127 in their checking account. They weren't just uncomfortable or struggling. They were in genuine crisis, the kind that ends with elderly people losing their homes and their health simultaneously. Then Mrs. Henderson called with news that changed everything. "Lindsay, your mother collapsed at the grocery store. She's at County General. It's her heart." Busting. I drove to County General Hospital, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, all my carefully constructed distance collapsing in the face of genuine medical emergency. The rational part of my brain that had orchestrated this entire withdrawal, that had methodically dismantled my family's safety net piece by piece, suddenly felt very small compared to the terrified daughter who didn't want her mother to die before things could be made right, even if right was impossible. I found my father in the cardiac waiting room, slumped in an orange plastic chair that seemed designed to make grief physically uncomfortable. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the 3 weeks since Thanksgiving, his face gray and deeply lined, his hands shaking slightly as they gripped a styrofoam cup of cold coffee. When he saw me walk through the automatic doors, his face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before, vulnerability replacing the distant indifference I'd known my entire life. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice breaking on the last word. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your mother... She's been so worried, and now this..." He stopped mid-sentence, confusion crossing his features as he realized he didn't have my current phone number, didn't know where I lived, couldn't reach me through any of the channels he'd taken for granted for 37 years. I opened my mouth to respond, but the waiting room doors burst open, and Heather rushed in, her expensive designer purse swinging from her shoulder in stark contrast to our father's worn canvas jacket with the fraying cuffs. Her eyes landed on me with immediate accusation, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sterile hospital air. "Oh, now you show up," she hissed, positioning herself between me and our father as if protecting him from contamination. "Where were you when they actually needed you? When Mom was struggling to breathe in the produce aisle? When Dad was calling every number he had, trying to find you?" I looked at her. This woman who'd stolen $200,000 from our parents while I'd been keeping them afloat, and felt nothing except a kind of distant curiosity about how she managed to manufacture such perfect, righteous indignation. I didn't respond to her performance. Instead, I walked past her to the nurse's station and asked calmly for my mother's status. The nurse, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, consulted her computer and told me my mother was stable, but they were running a comprehensive cardiac panel that it would be several hours before we knew anything definitive. I sat down in the waiting area, choosing a chair far enough from both my father and Heather to make conversation difficult, and prepared for the long uncertainty that hospitals impose on families. My father kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shame and desperate need. And finally, he stood and approached me with the hesitant movements of someone navigating a minefield. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, its edges worn soft with age, and held it out to me with trembling hands. "She made me promise to give this to you if anything ever happened to her," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the waiting room. "I didn't know she'd written it until last week when I was looking for her insurance cards. I haven't read it. I don't know what it says." He pressed the envelope into my hands and returned to his chair, and I sat there feeling the weight of something that would change everything. I couldn't read it in the waiting room with Heather's hostile eyes on me and my father's desperate hope hovering in the air, so I walked through the hospital corridors until I found the chapel, a small, non-sectarian room with uncomfortable pews and a stained glass window depicting abstract shapes that could mean anything to anyone. I sat in the back row and opened the envelope with hands that had started shaking somewhere between the waiting room and this quiet space. The letter was written on good stationery in my mother's precise cursive, the handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists my entire life, dated almost 3 years ago, when I'd still believed I could earn her love through perfect sacrifice. "Lindsay," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment to steady my breathing. "If you're reading this, I'm either gone or close to it, and I owe you a truth I should have told you 30 years ago. You are not your father's biological child." The words seemed to lift off the page and rearrange themselves in my vision, and I read them 3 times before their meaning penetrated the shock. My mother's careful sentences described a brief affair with a neighbor named David Morrison, a man I'd never heard of, a man who'd moved away before she knew she was pregnant with me. She'd been 23, engaged to my father, but uncertain, and David Morrison had been kind in ways that made her question everything about her planned future. When he left for a job opportunity in another state and she discovered she was pregnant 2 weeks later, she'd made a choice born of fear and convention. She married my father, quickly told him the truth, and he agreed to raise me as his own, under conditions she didn't specify in the letter, but that I could now imagine with devastating clarity. Every time he looked at you, he saw my betrayal, she wrote in that careful script. Every time I looked at you, I saw my shame. We treated you terribly, Lindsay, not because you deserved it, but because you reminded us of a secret we couldn't face. Heather never knew. We wanted to tell you, but the longer we waited, the more impossible it became. We loved you in our broken way, but we couldn't show it without admitting what you represented. Proof of my infidelity. Proof that our family was built on a lie. And the letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing years of conscious cruelty disguised as disciplined favoritism toward Heather as compensation for the guilt they felt about me, and a twisted logic that convinced them treating me poorly was somehow protecting the family secret. She ended with words that felt like they should have brought comfort, but instead just made the pain more complete. You deserved better than us. I hope someday you can forgive what we couldn't face. I sat in that chapel for 2 hours, the letter clutched in my hands, watching my entire life reorganize itself around this new information. Every dismissal, every comparison to Heather, every moment of feeling like I didn't quite belong. It all made terrible sense now. I wasn't their failure. I was their guilty secret, the living evidence of infidelity and deception, and they'd spent 37 years punishing an innocent child for their own choices. The cruelty hadn't been personal, which somehow made it worse, because at least personal cruelty suggests you're seen clearly enough to be rejected. This was something else entirely. I'd been rejected not for who I was, but for what I represented: collateral damage in their attempt to protect themselves from truth. When I finally emerged from the chapel, my father was standing outside in the hallway as if he'd been waiting there, and perhaps he had. "Did you read it?" he asked quietly, and I nodded because words felt impossible. He took a shaky breath and said something I'd waited my entire life to hear, even though it came 3 decades too late. "I found it in her drawer last week when I was looking for something else. I've known about you since the beginning, Lindsay. Before you were born, I agreed to raise you as mine, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let my pride hurt an innocent child who never asked to be caught in our mess." For the first time in my life, I watched my father cry real tears that tracked down his weathered face, and I felt nothing except a vast emptiness where forgiveness should have been. As I walked away from my father's tears, unable to offer comfort, I didn't feel a nurse called my name Ms. Foster. "We found something else in your mother's belongings, a safety deposit box key, and your name is on the account." The safety deposit box key felt impossibly heavy in my pocket as I drove to First Federal Bank the next morning. My mother still in the cardiac ICU under observation, my father keeping vigil in her room. Heather nowhere to be found. Janet Reeves, the bank manager who'd helped me uncover Heather's refinancing fraud just weeks ago, met me in the lobby with an expression of unusual gravity. She led me to a private consultation room, the kind reserved for estate matters and difficult financial conversations, and I noticed she'd brought a witness. Another bank officer whose presence made this feel oddly ceremonial. Janet explained that the safety deposit box had been opened 22 years ago by David Morrison, a name that now carried the weight of genetic truth with very specific instructions typed on official legal stationery. To be accessed by Lindsay Foster on her 35th birthday or in the event of her mother's serious illness or death, whichever comes first. I had turned 35 2 years ago, which meant this inheritance had been waiting for me while I was still trying to earn love from people who'd never planned to give it. Janet opened the box with a small key ceremony, turning it in the lock with both our signatures required, and inside I found the careful documentation of a life I'd never known existed. A thick manila envelope contained legal documents, their pages crisp despite their age, professionally prepared by a law firm in Chicago. A thumb drive in a small plastic case labeled simply, "For Lindsay," in handwriting I'd never seen, but somehow recognized as belonging to someone who shared my DNA. And a handwritten letter on yellowed stationery, the paper quality expensive, the ink faded slightly, but still perfectly legible. The date at the top made my breath catch. March 15, 2003, just 3 months before David Morrison died of pancreatic cancer, according to the death certificate included in the legal documents. He'd written this knowing he was dying, knowing he'd never meet the daughter he'd watched from the shadows for 25 years. The letter began with an apology that felt more genuine than anything my mother had written in her deathbed confession. "Lindsay, I don't have the right to call you my daughter because I gave up that right when I left your mother before knowing she was pregnant. But I've watched you your entire life, and I want you to know that every achievement, every struggle, every moment of your life mattered to someone even when you felt invisible." He described attending my middle school graduation sitting in the back row of the auditorium while my parents sat in the front looking bored, watching me receive an academic excellence award that they never mentioned at home. He wrote about seeing my college acceptance letters in their trash can when he drove by their house one evening, how he'd retrieved them and kept them as proof of my worth, even if they couldn't see it. Most devastating, he admitted to anonymously funding the scholarship that had paid my last year of business school tuition, the one I'd received from the Midwest Professional Women's Foundation that I'd later discovered didn't actually exist. That was him. That was my father watching from a distance, supporting me in the only ways he could without revealing the truth that would have destroyed what little family stability I had. The legal documents explained the trust fund with the kind of precision that comes from careful estate planning done by someone who knows they're running out of time. David Morrison had built a successful medical equipment sales business, lived in a modest apartment in Chicago, never married, and poured everything into an investment portfolio, managed by professionals with one single beneficiary, me. The total value as of the most recent quarterly statement was $2.3 million. I sat in that private bank room, staring at numbers that represented a biological father's love measured in dollars and years of compound interest, and I couldn't stop crying. Janet quietly offered me tissues and time stepping out to give me privacy with this inheritance of money and grief intertwined. The trust terms were remarkably simple for such a substantial amount. I could access the funds starting at age 35 with complete discretion over their use, no restrictions, no requirements, except a single codicil added 1 year before his death. I read it through tears that made the words blur and refocus. "I know your mother and her husband haven't treated you well. I've seen it from a distance, and it's broken my heart to watch you try so hard to earn love that should have been freely given. This money isn't meant to replace a father's love because nothing can replace what I failed to give you by not fighting harder to be in your life. But it can give you the freedom to choose your own family, to build your own life, to never depend on people who can't see your worth. You are not defined by their inability to love you properly. You are defined by your own strength, your own kindness, your own remarkable persistence in becoming someone extraordinary despite every obstacle they placed in your path." I left the bank 3 hours later with legal documents giving me access to wealth I'd never imagined, with a thumb drive containing what Janet said were video files I should watch when I was ready, and with the knowledge that I'd been loved by a father I never knew more consistently than by the parents who raised me. The power dynamic of my entire life had shifted in a single morning. I could pay off my parents' mortgage completely, erase their debt, restore their comfortable life, and they'd never have to know it was me. I could expose Heather's theft in ways that would destroy what remained of her reputation. I could disappear entirely, move across the country, start fresh somewhere nobody knew the foster family drama. Or I could do something more complex, something strategic that would force everyone to face the truth, while also breaking the cycle of secrets and lies that had poisoned 3 generations. That evening, I called Eleanor Park, my attorney, and asked for an emergency meeting. Eleanor had helped me structure Iron Leaf Care Group years ago, had guided me through complex business decisions with wisdom that went beyond legal expertise into genuine strategic thinking. We met at her office after hours, and I told her everything: the Thanksgiving humiliation, the financial withdrawal, my mother's letter, Heather's theft, and now this inheritance from a father I'd never known. I expected her to focus on the legal implications, the estate, planning the tactical options. Instead, she sat back in her leather chair and said something that completely reframed my thinking. "Lindsay, you've been asking yourself the wrong question for weeks now. You keep wondering, how do I hurt them back? Or, do I save them? Or, how do I make them understand what they did to me? But those are all questions that keep you trapped in their narrative where you're reacting to them." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "The real question is, how do I use this power to break the cycle? Your biological father didn't give you money to get revenge or to rescue people who didn't appreciate you. He gave you the freedom to choose who you want to be independent of your family's dysfunction. That's a much more powerful gift than you're recognizing." I left that meeting with a plan forming in my mind, something that would save my family, but on terms they'd never anticipated. They would learn the truth about everything who had supported them all these years, who had betrayed them, and who I really was beneath the dismissed daughter they'd never bothered to see clearly. But first, I needed to give them something they'd never given me: honesty. 3 weeks after my mother's initial collapse, she was released from County General with a list of medications and stern warnings about stress management, and I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I scheduled a press conference at my parents' home, contacting the local newspaper, 2 Indianapolis television stations, and key members of the Hendricks County community with a carefully worded announcement. Ironleaf Care Group founder Lindsay Foster will make an important announcement regarding elder care fraud and family financial exploitation. I didn't tell my parents what was coming. I didn't warn Heather. I simply sent a formal notification that I would be making a statement at their address on a cold January morning, and I trusted that curiosity and small-town gossip would do the rest. The morning arrived with that particular Midwestern winter clarity that makes everything look sharper and more real. Marcus arrived early with equipment, setting up a projector and screen on my parents' front porch, while neighbors began gathering on the lawn, their breath visible in the freezing air. My parents watched from inside, confusion evident on their faces as more people arrived, as reporters with cameras took positions, as town council members I'd invited specifically for their community influence clustered together, comparing notes. Heather pulled up in a borrowed car with a man in an expensive suit, who I later learned was an attorney she'd hired on credit, convinced this announcement was about the refinancing fraud and preparing for legal defense. Nearly 50 people gathered on that front lawn by 9 o'clock, and I stood on the porch in a navy suit that Marcus had picked up from my apartment, looking nothing like the woman who'd been handed a dirty mop in that house just 2 months ago. I began speaking without introduction, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, given how my hands were shaking. For 7 years I have quietly supported my parents financially, while being told I'm the family disappointment, the daughter who never quite measured up, the one who contributed nothing of value. Today, I'm going to show you what that support actually looked like. Marcus clicked the first slide, and the projector displayed a spreadsheet on the screen behind me, numbers in neat columns that represented years of invisible sacrifice. Every mortgage payment, every insurance premium, every property tax installment, every utility bill documented with dates and amounts. The crowd went silent as they processed what they were seeing, and then came the total at the bottom, $347,000. I heard gasps, heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," and I continued before the shock could wear off. "But it wasn't just money," I said, and Marcus played the next slide's video footage from Ironleaf Care Group home, visits my company's nurses checking my parents' blood pressure aids, cleaning their kitchen coordinators, delivering groceries and medications. My parents' faces were clearly visible in the footage, as were the care workers' gentle interactions, the professional service they'd been receiving twice weekly for 3 years. My parents thought this was a government assistance program, some blessing they'd earned through good fortune. It was me. It was always me. I turned toward the front window where my parents stood, frozen, my mother's hand pressed against the glass. "I did this because I loved you. Because I thought if I could just support you enough, sacrifice enough, stay quiet enough, you would eventually see my worth. And you gave me a mop." The emotional weight of that statement hung in the cold air for a moment, before I moved to the evidence I'd been dreading but knew was necessary. Marcus displayed bank records on the screen documents showing the refinancing that had pulled $120,000 from my parents' home equity, the forged signature that barely resembled my father's actual handwriting, the account transfer into Heather's name. Then came transaction records showing years of systematic theft, disguised as family help, nearly $200,000 extracted through manipulation and lies. While I was supporting them in silence, I said quietly, looking directly at Heather, who had gone pale, my sister was stealing from them, and somehow I was the disappointing daughter. The crowd erupted into chaos. Neighbors who'd judged me for abandoning my parents, who'd whispered about my ingratitude and coldness, now understood the truth in a way that made some of them look ashamed. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing, and I saw Heather try to run toward her car, but the crowd had blocked her path, their bodies forming an unintentional barrier. My father stumbled out onto the porch, his mouth opening and closing without sound, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Then my mother appeared in the doorway, still visibly fragile from her hospitalization, leaning heavily on the doorframe, and tears were streaming down her face. She mouthed something I couldn't hear over the noise. It looked like, "I'm sorry," but the words were lost in the commotion. Mrs. Henderson, standing in the front row, bundled in her winter coat, started clapping. It began slowly, deliberately, and then others joined, not everyone because some people were too shocked and others too uncomfortable with this level of public family devastation. But enough that the sound became unmistakable. I stood there on that porch listening to applause that felt more like judgment than celebration, and I realized I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. Instead, I felt profoundly exhausted, hollowed out by years of carrying secrets and the weight of finally releasing them. I raised my hand for quiet, and the crowd slowly settled. "I want to be clear about something," I said, my voice carrying across the lawn. "I'm not pressing charges against my sister. I'm not seeking repayment from my parents. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I needed you all to know the truth before you judge people's worth by their silence. Before you assume that absence means abandonment. Before you decide that the quiet ones are the ones who don't care." I looked at the reporters at the cameras recording this moment. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones you never see, and sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones everyone celebrates. I walked down the porch steps, moving through the crowd that parted for me, heading toward my car parked at the end of the street. Behind me, I could hear the chaos resuming, reporters surrounding Heather, neighbors approaching my father with questions, the whole terrible machinery of public revelation grinding forward. I was almost to my car when I heard a sound that made me turn around, a heavy thud, then screaming. My mother had collapsed on the porch, her body crumpling in a way that looked wrong, and people were rushing toward her, someone shouting for someone to call 911. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later, and I found myself in its harsh interior, once again holding my mother's hand as paramedics worked around us. This time, when we reached the hospital and the doctors examined her, their faces were grave in a way they hadn't been 3 weeks ago. Her heart was failing. They said the stress-induced damage compounding her underlying condition, and they asked me the question I'd been avoiding my entire life. "Are you her next of kin?" I spent 3 hours in the cardiac ICU waiting room wrestling with my conscience while my mother asked repeatedly to see me. Her requests relayed through nurses who looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite interpret. My father sat across from me. His posture collapsed inward like a building that had lost its structural support, unable to meet my eyes after the public exposure of everything he'd helped conceal for 37 years. Dr. Wells, my therapist, had told me during an emergency phone session that I didn't owe my mother anything, that I could walk away and let her face the consequences of her choices alone. But sitting in that waiting room, I realized that walking away now would haunt me in ways that staying hadn't. Finally, I told the nurse I would visit for 10 minutes, no more, and followed her through the secured doors into the ICU, where machines beeped with the rhythms of failing hearts. My mother looked diminished in the hospital bed, her body seeming to take up less space than it should, oxygen tubes running to her nose and IV lines trailing from both arms. Her hair, usually colored and styled with meticulous care, lay gray and thin against the white pillow, and for the first time, I saw her as genuinely old rather than just aging. She opened her eyes when I approached, and I watched something like relief cross her face before being replaced by fear. "I know you hate me," she whispered, her voice rough from intubation. I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, folding my hands carefully in my lap, a gesture of control I'd learned over years of managing emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "I don't hate you," I said, and found that it was true in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm just done being hurt by you. There's a difference." What followed was 30 minutes of conversation more honest than any we'd had in my entire life, her words tumbling out in fragments as if she'd been holding them back for decades and the dam had finally broken. She admitted the affair with David Morrison without euphemism, describing a relationship that lasted 3 months and made her feel seen in ways her engagement to my father never had. She talked about the decades of projecting her shame onto me, treating her own guilt like something that could be purged by punishing the innocent child who represented it. She explained with a clarity that felt almost clinical how she'd trained Heather to treat me as lesser because having both daughters acknowledge my worth felt too dangerous to the family fiction. "I tore your face out of that photo because every time I looked at it, I saw my sin," she said, her voice breaking. "Not you, Lindsay. My sin. And I couldn't separate the two." She tried to apologize then, but the words came out wrong, laced with self-justification, even as she claimed remorse. "You have to understand, I was trapped. Your father, the man who raised you, he agreed to accept you, but only if I never showed you favoritism. We thought if we treated you the same or even less, people wouldn't suspect the truth. And then it became a habit we couldn't break. And then I couldn't stop even when I wanted to, because changing how we treated you would have raised questions we couldn't answer." Her tears flowed freely now, the heart monitor beeping faster as her distress registered in escalating numbers. I listened to this apology that wasn't quite an apology, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "You weren't trapped, Mom," I said quietly. "You chose. Every single day for 37 years, you chose to protect yourself and your secret, instead of protecting a child who needed you. Those were choices, not traps." A nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned as she glanced at the monitors, and I knew I should leave before this conversation caused more medical complications. But there was one question I needed answered, one truth that had haunted me since reading her letter in the hospital chapel weeks ago. "Did you ever love me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Even a little, or was I always just the problem you couldn't solve?" My mother's face crumpled, and she was silent for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words destroyed something I'd been hoping for without realizing I still carried that hope. "I don't know," she whispered. "I tried. I wanted to. But loving you felt dangerous. Like if I let myself love you, I'd have to face everything I'd done wrong, so I just didn't." I stood to leave, needing to escape before her honesty broke something in me that I couldn't repair, but her hand shot out and grabbed mine with surprising strength for someone so fragile. "Wait, there's more. Another letter. Actually, many letters. In my purse, the red one on the chair. From David. He wrote to me every year on your birthday. I never opened them. I was too afraid of what they'd say, what they'd make me feel. But you should have them. You should know he thought about you, that he—" She trailed off, exhausted, and released my hand. I found her red leather purse on the visitor's chair and opened it, discovering inside a bundle of envelopes bound with a rubber band that had grown brittle with age. 27 letters I counted quickly, each one addressed to my mother in the same masculine handwriting, each one marked with a date that corresponded to one of my birthdays, starting from my 10th year until I assumed David Morrison's death. She'd kept them all without opening a single one, storing my father's words like toxic waste too dangerous to examine but too significant to discard. I didn't read them in the hospital because I couldn't process another revelation in that sterile room with my mother watching me from her bed of failing organs. Instead, I tucked the bundle into my bag and walked out of the ICU past my father, who tried to ask me something I pretended not to hear through the automatic doors into the cold January night. As I sat in my car in the parking garage, I held those 27 letters and understood something profound. My biological father had been more present in my life from a distance than the people who raised me had been while living in the same house. He'd remembered every birthday they forgot. He'd documented achievements they dismissed. He'd loved me from the shadows because that was the only option my mother had given him. I left the hospital with 27 letters from a father I never knew. I didn't realize that reading them would unlock a secret that would explain everything and destroy what little remained of my relationship with Heather. That night, I spread all 27 letters across my apartment floor in chronological order and read them like archaeological evidence of a life I'd lived without knowing I was being witnessed. David Morrison wrote with the kind of careful observation that comes from loving someone you can never claim his handwriting, evolving from confident to shakier, as cancer presumably weakened him over those final years. He described my 7th grade science fair project on water purification, noting details about my presentation style that even I had forgotten, and I wondered how he'd known to be there, how he'd managed to watch without being seen. He wrote about my high school graduation speech, quoting phrases I'd delivered about perseverance and self-determination, saying he'd sat in the back row weeping while my parents checked their phones in the 3rd row. He mentioned my first major business contract when I was 25, telling my mother he'd been following my LinkedIn profile and felt pride that had no outlet except these annual letters she never opened. But it was the letter dated on my 26th birthday that made my hands start shaking, its contents shifting everything I thought I understood about Heather. "I saw you and Heather having coffee at that place downtown last Tuesday," he wrote in his precise cursive. "I was at the corner table by the window and I watched the two of you talk for nearly an hour. She looked at you with such sadness when you weren't watching, a kind of grief I recognized, because I carry the same thing, the pain of knowing something that creates distance from someone you should be close to. I wonder if she knows the truth about your parentage. I wonder if that's why she keeps you at arm's length, even when she's sitting right next to you." My stomach dropped as I read those words 3 times each reading, making the implications clearer and more devastating. I scrambled to my laptop and searched through old photo files until I found a picture from that exact coffee meeting, one Heather had posted on Facebook with some caption about sister bonding that I'd scrolled past with the usual pang of knowing it wasn't real. I zoomed in on the background, and there he was, barely visible at a corner table, an older man with graying hair watching us over a newspaper. David Morrison. My biological father observing his daughter have coffee with the sister who maybe possibly knew the secret that defined both our lives. I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by letters and remembered that afternoon with sudden sharp clarity. Heather had been unusually quiet, emotional, in a way that seemed disconnected from our mundane conversation about nothing important. And then, out of nowhere, she'd asked a question that had seemed strange at the time. "Do you ever feel like you don't really belong in our family? Like you're fundamentally different from the rest of us?" I drove to Heather's address at midnight, the bundle of letters still in my hands, my mind racing through years of interactions now reframed by this possibility. She lived in a small rental house on the east side now, her Mercedes gone, her big house lost to debt and divorce. Everything stripped down to its most basic elements. I pounded on the door hard enough that lights turned on in neighboring houses, and when Heather finally opened it, she looked terrified until she saw it was me, at which point her expression shifted to something between resignation and relief. "Did you know?" I demanded without preamble, holding up the letters as evidence of something I couldn't quite articulate. "Did you know I wasn't Dad's biological daughter?" Her face gave her away before any words could, a crumpling of features that confirmed everything. She stepped back from the door and I followed her inside to a living room that was almost empty. Most of her furniture sold to pay debts, just a couch and a folding chair remaining. "I found out when I was 16, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed my birth certificate for my driver's license application, and I was digging through the file cabinet in Dad's office while they were at the grocery store. I found everything: Mom's medical records from her pregnancy with you documents about David Morrison. Even a letter he'd written to Mom before I was born. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I confronted Mom that night, and she begged me never to tell you. She said it would destroy the family that Dad would leave if the secret came out, that our whole life would fall apart. I was 16 years old, Lindsay. I didn't know what to do with information that big, that destructive. Heather started crying then, and these weren't the calculated tears I'd seen her deploy so effectively over the years. These were raw, painful sobs that came from somewhere deep and long suppressed. Every time I looked at you after that, I felt this crushing guilt for knowing something you didn't know. So I pushed you away. I treated you badly because if I convinced myself you deserved poor treatment, then I wouldn't feel so horrible for keeping this massive secret from you. She sat down on the couch, her whole body shaking. Mom told me I was protecting you, that knowing the truth would hurt you more than not knowing. And I believed her because I was a kid, and I needed to believe I was doing something noble instead of something cowardly. Over the next 2 hours, as the night deepened outside her bare windows, Heather told me everything. How the secret had become her identity. How every achievement of mine felt like an accusation that she'd made the wrong choice in staying silent. She described a twisted internal logic, where diminishing me made the lie easier to carry. If I wasn't that successful, if I wasn't that capable, if I wasn't that valuable, then maybe it was acceptable that she'd kept this truth from me. When my business took off, despite her attempts at undermining me when I became undeniably successful, her cognitive dissonance had driven her to more desperate measures. The refinancing fraud, the systematic theft, the exploitation of our parents. She claimed it was all part of a subconscious attempt to prove I wasn't as competent as I appeared to justify the secret she'd been carrying for 21 years. I was trying to tear you down to make the lie easier to live with. She confessed, her voice hoarse from crying. And in the process, I destroyed my own life. My marriage, my reputation, my relationship with my kids who barely speak to me now. I don't expect forgiveness, Lindsay. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and that I finally understand that Mom manipulated both of us. She made me complicit in your pain when I was too young to know better, and I let that complicity define me for 2 decades. As I left Heather's house that night, driving through empty streets back to my apartment, I realized none of us were villains in this story. We were all just casualties of a secret that poisoned everyone it touched. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. 2 weeks after the press conference, Mrs. Henderson called with news I'd been dreading, but expecting. The bank had posted a foreclosure notice on my parents' home. She described finding my father on the front porch in freezing February weather, still wearing his pajamas, under a thin jacket, just staring at the official document taped to their front door. The notice gave them 90 days to either pay $180,000 or vacate the property, and we both knew they didn't have a fraction of that amount, Mrs. Henderson's voice was gentle but concerned when she told me he'd lost at least 15 pounds since Thanksgiving, that he looked a decade older, that he sat on that porch for 2 hours before she finally convinced him to go inside. My mother was still recovering from her cardiac episode, taking medications that cost hundreds of dollars, even with Medicare coverage, and I knew from my access to their accounts that they were choosing between prescriptions and groceries most weeks now. The family's disintegration accelerated with the kind of momentum that comes from structures built on lies finally collapsing under their own weight. Heather's husband Tom filed for divorce 3 days after the press conference, and he'd taken their children to his parents' house in Ohio, claiming he needed to protect them from the chaos of their mother's legal troubles and public scandal. I learned this through the town gossip channels, not from Heather herself, who'd stopped trying to contact me after our midnight confrontation. When I drove past my parents' house one cold evening, telling myself I was just taking a different route home, but knowing I was checking on them in the only way I could manage, I saw a handmade "For Sale by Owner" sign staked in the front yard. The asking price, visible in marker on white poster board, was $50,000 below market value, the desperate number of people who needed money immediately and had no time for proper real estate procedures. I sat in my car across the street and looked at the oak tree in the front yard. remembering the day my father and I had planted it when I was 12. I'd held the sapling steady while he filled in dirt, and for those 30 minutes I'd felt like I belonged to him. The town's reaction to my public revelations split down predictable lines, creating a controversy that the local newspaper covered with the enthusiasm of a community starved for drama. Half the population seemed to think I was justified, that I'd been exploited for years, and finally stood up for myself. I heard through Marcus that some women's groups in Indianapolis had reached out wanting me to speak about setting boundaries with toxic family members, that I'd become an unexpected symbol of adult children protecting themselves from parental exploitation. But the other half viewed me as cruel and vindictive, arguing that no matter what my parents had done, humiliating them publicly was a bridge too far. The Hendricks County Gazette ran dueling opinion pieces on consecutive days: "When family becomes toxic, one woman's brave stand," versus "The dangers of public shame. Where do we draw the line?" I read both once, and then stopped following the coverage because what disturbed me wasn't the criticism, but the hollowness I felt reading the praise. I'd expected vindication, that satisfying feeling of being proven right after years of being dismissed, but instead, I just felt empty watching my parents lose everything, while knowing I had the resources to save them with a single phone call. Dr. Wells, during our weekly session, warned me about the temptation to rescue them. "Saving them now wouldn't teach them anything," she said, with the gentle firmness that made her an effective therapist. "It would just reset the old dynamic where you're invisible and sacrificing, and they're entitled and taking. You'd be right back where you started, except now you'd also resent yourself for giving in." I knew she was right intellectually, but emotionally, I was struggling with the image of my elderly parents losing their home, my mother's health failing under stress, my father's pride being systematically destroyed by consequences that, yes, they'd earned, but that still felt brutal to watch unfold. Then my father called me directly for the first time since Thanksgiving, his number showing up on my phone at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. My mother had been readmitted to the hospital with another cardiac episode, and this time the doctors were using words like critical and limited time. His voice on the phone was broken in ways I'd never heard, stripped of all the dismissive distance that had characterized our relationship for 37 years. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he said, speaking quickly as if afraid I'd hang up before he finished. "I know we've destroyed any claim we had to your help or your presence. But your mother is dying, Lindsay. Not in some abstract future way, but now. She's dying now, and she keeps calling your name. Whatever you think of us, whatever we deserve, she's dying, and she wants you." I stood in my apartment holding the phone, feeling 20 years of accumulated pain and anger fight against the small, frightened child who still lived somewhere inside me, the one who'd spent her whole life wanting her mother to love her. I looked at the bundle of letters from David Morrison on my coffee table, at the trust fund documents that had given me financial freedom, at the life I'd built, despite every obstacle my family had placed in my path. And I made a decision that surprised even me. "I'll come to the hospital," I told my father. "But we're going to have a conversation. All of us, you, Mom, if she's able, and Heather, and you're going to tell me the complete truth about everything. Every detail, every secret. No more lies, no more protected information. That's my condition for being there." There was a long pause, and then my father said quietly, "Okay, whatever you need. Just please come." What I didn't know was that the truth they were about to tell me was far more devastating than anything I'd imagined. I arrived at County General Hospital an hour later and found them waiting in a small conference room the staff used for difficult family meetings, the kind where decisions about end-of-life care get made under fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look half dead already. My mother sat in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank beside her, her breathing labored even at rest. My father occupied a plastic chair that seemed too small for his frame, and Heather stood by the window looking like she wanted to disappear through the glass. At my request, a hospital social worker named Patricia sat in the corner with a notepad there to witness whatever truths were about to be spoken and to intervene if the conversation became too medically dangerous for my mother's failing heart. My mother began speaking before I'd fully settled into my chair, as if she'd been rehearsing these words and feared losing her nerve. 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. She said, her voice thin but steady. It was treatable, very treatable but expensive. The aggressive treatment plan my oncologist recommended would have cost $85,000 after insurance, radiation, targeted therapy, the whole comprehensive approach. We'd just refinanced the house to help Heather with her business startup, and we didn't have that kind of money available. My mind immediately went to 5 years ago, to Heather's supposed boutique business that had failed within 6 months, the venture I'd always suspected was more fiction than reality. My mother continued, seemingly unaware of the calculation happening in my head. The doctor gave me 2 options: the aggressive treatment with an 85% survival rate, or minimal treatment for $20,000 with a 40% survival rate. I chose the cheaper option because Heather's wedding was coming up in 6 months and she needed it to be perfect. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with enough force to make breathing difficult. You chose a worse cancer treatment for a wedding. I asked, my voice coming out strangled. You chose a 40% survival rate instead of 85%, because my sister needed a party. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached toward me with a trembling hand that I didn't take. You don't understand what it was like. Heather was struggling so much. Her engagement was falling apart. Tom was having second thoughts, and she was talking about calling off the wedding. I thought if she had this one perfect day, if she felt secure and loved and celebrated, she'd be okay. She'd have something to build on. She paused, gasping slightly for breath before continuing. And you were always so strong, Lindsay. Even as a child, you just handled things. You never seemed to need us the way Heather did. I thought you'd be fine. I thought you were invincible. My father spoke, then his voice carrying a guilt that sounded like it had been fermenting for years. I told her not to do it. I argued with her about it for weeks. But your mother believed that Heather would fall apart without that wedding, and that you'd be fine without a mother, because you'd always managed to be fine without much parenting from us anyway. The casual cruelty of that statement, delivered without apparent awareness of what it revealed, made the social worker look up sharply from her notes. I felt something cold and hard forming in my chest as I forced myself to speak. I paid for that wedding, I said, my voice shaking now. 7 years ago, I transferred $100,000 into your account. I labeled it Family Emergency Fund because I knew you were struggling financially. You used my money to pay for Heather's wedding instead of saving your own life. My mother's face registered genuine shock, her mouth opening and closing as she processed this information. That was you. The money that appeared in our account, we thought it was from one of the state assistance programs we'd applied for. We never knew. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I'd provided the funds that could have saved her life, and she'd used them to throw a party for the daughter she openly favored, while choosing to die slowly, rather than admit she needed help from the daughter she'd dismissed. But there was more, and my mother continued with the relentless honesty of someone who knows they're running out of time to tell the truth. The minimal treatment had worked for 3 years, keeping the cancer at bay through basic chemotherapy and prayer, but then it had returned with a vengeance. Stage 4 now metastasized to her bones and affecting her heart, which explained the cardiac episodes that had brought us to this point. The cardiologist had explicitly told her that the emotional stress from the Thanksgiving incident, the financial collapse, and the public humiliation had accelerated her physical decline, that her heart couldn't handle the combination of cancer and devastation. The doctor says I have maybe 6 months, she whispered, and I watched Heather turn away from the window, crying silently. I'm telling you this not to make you feel guilty for what you did, because I deserved all of it. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I made terrible choices. I chose wrong over and over again. I protected Heather when I should have protected you. I treated you badly because I was ashamed of my own choices, and I convinced myself you were strong enough not to need my love. I was wrong about everything. She reached out her hand again, and this time I took it, Not because I'd forgiven her or because the pain had disappeared, but because I was watching a human being reckon with her failures at the end of her life, and that deserved some acknowledgement of our shared humanity. My mother died 3 days later, holding my hand, whispering apologies I wasn't ready to accept. And when her lawyer read the will, I learned she'd made one final choice that would change everything. The funeral was a small, awkward affair held on a gray February morning with fewer than 20 people in attendance, most of them elderly neighbors who came out of obligation rather than genuine grief. Heather sat in the front row with our father, both of them hollow-eyed and diminished, while I sat 3 rows back with Marcus, who'd insisted on coming despite my protests that I'd be fine alone. 1 week later, we gathered in Eleanor Park's office for the will reading, the same attorney who'd helped me navigate David Morrison's trust fund, and who now handled my mother's final wishes with professional solemnity. The will was surprisingly detailed for someone who'd spent most of her life avoiding difficult truths, clearly written during the months when she knew death was approaching, and had apparently decided to face at least some of her failures. Eleanor read through the bequests with careful neutrality. To my father, the family photo albums, his workshop tools, and $5,000 in a savings account I hadn't known existed. To Heather, their grandmother's jewelry collection, which included several valuable pieces and a sealed letter that Eleanor handed to her without reading aloud. To me, everything else which Eleanor explained meant the house currently in foreclosure, all remaining assets, and full control of the estate, with one specific instruction she read directly from the document. Lindsay has my permission to use these assets in whatever way honors truth, justice, and the family we should have been. The phrase felt like both an apology and an abdication of responsibility, my mother trying to make amends by giving me permission to fix what she'd broken. Eleanor then provided the financial reality with the gentle tone of someone delivering bad news they know will hurt. The estate's estimated value after debts was nearly nothing. The house was underwater by $60,000, meaning the mortgage exceeded its current market value. There were $32,000 in medical bills from my mother's various hospitalizations and cancer treatments. Credit card debt totaled $18,000, accumulated over years of trying to maintain appearances while drowning financially. My mother had left me not wealth, but the responsibility of cleaning up the wreckage of a life lived in secrets and poor choices. Heather, who'd been uncharacteristically silent during the funeral and the early part of the will reading, exploded with an anger that seemed to have been building for days. "This is complete bullshit," she shouted, standing up so abruptly her chair fell backward. "You manipulated her at the end. You barely visited her in the hospital, but somehow you convinced her to give you everything and leave me with jewelry and a letter. You poisoned her against me." The lawyer she'd brought, a nervous young man I later learned was working on contingency because Heather couldn't afford to pay him, suggested they could contest the will based on undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated a dying woman when she was vulnerable and not thinking clearly. Eleanor responded with the calm precision of an attorney who'd anticipated this exact challenge. She produced hospital visitation records, showing that I'd seen my mother exactly 3 times in her final 3 weeks, always with medical staff present, while Heather had visited daily during the same period. She then presented a notarized affidavit from the attorney who'd originally drafted the will, confirming it had been written 6 months ago, long before the Thanksgiving incident, and the public revelation that had destroyed our family's facade. "Your mother made these choices when she was of sound mind and not under any undue pressure from Lindsay," Eleanor said firmly. "If you want to contest this, well, you're welcome to try, but I should warn you that you'll be spending money you don't have on a case you won't win." Heather turned to me, her face twisted with desperation and rage. "You took everything from me, Lindsay. You ruined my life with your public humiliation. You destroyed my marriage, my reputation, my relationship with my children. And now you're taking the last thing Mom left me." I looked at this woman who was technically my half-sister, who'd known about my parentage for 21 years, who'd stolen from our parents while I supported them, and I felt only exhaustion. "I'll fight you in court if you pursue this," I said quietly. "And you'll lose, again." That night, sitting in my apartment with the weight of my mother's estate now legally mine, I made a decision about who I wanted to become in the aftermath of all this destruction. I used funds from David Morrison's trust to pay off all of my mother's debts, writing checks that totaled over $100,000. Not because she deserved this final rescue, but because I refused to let her mistakes become my burden or my father's complete ruin. Then I contacted the bank handling the foreclosure and made them an offer I would purchase my parents' house at auction and pay cash, with the understanding that my father could remain living there rent-free for as long as he chose. Within 3 weeks, I'd transformed my mother's failure into something purposeful. The house became Grace Haven, a transitional housing facility for women over 40 escaping financial abuse or family exploitation. I hired contractors to renovate the interior, converting the large space into 4 small private apartments, plus common areas where residents could cook together, support each other, and rebuild their lives. The symbolism was entirely intentional. The house where I'd been handed a mop and told to know my place would become a sanctuary for women who'd been similarly diminished. The old living room scene of my Thanksgiving humiliation became a community gathering space with comfortable furniture and walls painted in warm colors that felt nothing like the cold formality my mother had maintained. And on the main wall of that room, I hung a simple wooden plaque that Marcus had commissioned from a local craftsperson, its message carved in elegant letters, "You are not what they said you were." 2 days after announcing Grace Haven at a small press conference, Heather's attorney filed a lawsuit with the county court. The complaint was titled "Estate Fraud and Emotional Manipulation," and it claimed I'd systematically destroyed my mother's mental state to gain control of her assets. The court date was set for 60 days. And this time, Heather had evidence I'd never seen coming. Heather's attorney was a man named Jonathan Reeves, a personal injury lawyer known throughout Indianapolis for taking sensational cases on contingency and winning through aggressive media campaigns rather than legal merit. The lawsuit he filed claimed that I had systematically isolated and manipulated a vulnerable dying woman to disinherit her younger daughter. And the complaint included allegations so explosive they seemed designed more for headlines than for courtroom credibility. According to the filing, I had threatened to cut off my parents financially unless my mother changed her will, had deliberately caused my mother's stress-induced cardiac episodes through calculated emotional abuse, and was using the estate for personal gain while pretending Grace Haven was charitable work. Reeves called a press conference on the courthouse steps 3 days after filing, with Heather standing beside him, wearing a simple black dress and minimal makeup, looking appropriately devastated for the cameras. My client's mother was coerced on her deathbed by a daughter with unlimited resources and a decades-old grudge, Reeves announced to the assembled reporters, his voice carrying that particular blend of outrage and sorrow that trial lawyers perfect over years of practice. This is a case about elder abuse, about a powerful woman who used her wealth and influence to punish her family and steal her dying mother's final wishes. The local television stations ran with the story immediately, their evening broadcasts leading with dramatic headlines, "Thanksgiving Mop Controversy Takes Dark Turn," and "Daughter Accused of Deathbed Manipulation." Online comment sections exploded with opinions that split predictably along lines of gender, age, and personal experience with family dysfunction. Some people defended me, recognizing the lawsuit as a desperate attempt by someone who'd been caught stealing, but others called me a sociopath who'd essentially killed her own mother through deliberately inflicted stress. Discovery began 2 weeks later, and Eleanor called me to her office to review the evidence Heather's legal team had submitted. What I saw made my stomach turn, with a combination of rage and grudging admiration for the sophistication of the deception. Text messages allegedly from my phone to my mother's, sent during her final months, contained threats that sounded plausible enough to be believed: "If you don't make this right, you'll never see me again," and "I've supported you for years. It's time you recognize that in your will." I stared at the screenshots displayed on Eleanor's monitor, my hands shaking slightly as I processed what I was seeing. "I never sent these," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Eleanor, I swear I never wrote any of this." Eleanor nodded with the grim expression of an attorney who'd seen this before. They're fakes, but they're sophisticated fakes. The metadata has been altered professionally and we'll need a forensic digital expert to prove they're manufactured. That's going to cost about $15,000 and take 3 weeks. There was more evidence, affidavits from 2 of Heather's friends claiming they'd overheard me making cruel comments about my parents at a restaurant, saying things like, "They deserve everything that's coming to them," and "I can't wait until they're gone so I can finally be free." I remembered the dinner they referenced because it had been a Ironleaf Care Group strategy meeting with 3 colleagues, and Heather's friends hadn't been anywhere near that restaurant. But in court, it would be my word against signed affidavits, and juries often struggled to understand why people would lie under oath. The worst piece of evidence was an audio recording that Reeves had submitted as a voicemail I allegedly left on my mother's phone 2 weeks before she died. Eleanor played it for me, and I heard my own voice saying words I'd never spoken. "You better do the right thing or you'll regret it. I'm not going to keep supporting people who don't appreciate what I do for them." The voice was mine, but also not mine, the cadence slightly off the word choices, not quite matching how I actually spoke. Eleanor stopped the recording halfway through and explained what we were dealing with: AI-generated audio, created by feeding samples of my voice from public speeches into sophisticated software that could then manufacture entire conversations I'd never had. As the trial date approached, Heather launched a social media campaign that proved devastatingly effective in ways I hadn't anticipated. She posted childhood photographs of the 2 of us at birthday parties and family holidays, images I'd forgotten existed, with captions like, "Before money and success changed her," and "When we were still sisters who loved each other." She gave a tearful interview to a local television station that went viral online, her performance pitch perfect in its combination of remorse and wounded dignity. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I stole from my parents and I'm deeply ashamed of that. I'm in therapy now, working on understanding why I did it, trying to make amends. But Lindsay won't even give me a chance to apologize, because she'd rather destroy me completely than allow for the possibility of forgiveness or redemption." The narrative shift was subtle but powerful, and I watched it happen in real time through the metrics Marcus tracked obsessively. Heather transformed from villain to repentant sinner, seeking forgiveness, while I became the wealthy, vindictive sister who couldn't let go of past hurts and insisted on total destruction rather than reconciliation. Marcus and my friends at Ironleaf Care Group rallied around me, creating a website that documented my decade of charitable work and soliciting testimonials from former clients whose lives I'd genuinely helped. But the damage had already taken root in public consciousness, and even Mrs. Henderson, my most loyal ally, called to warn me gently. "Some people in town are saying you've gone too far, dear. They think maybe Heather deserves a chance to rebuild her life without you constantly exposing her mistakes." The trial was 3 weeks away when Eleanor called with news that made my blood run cold. "Lindsay, they've subpoenaed someone from your past. Someone who claims they can testify about your character. Someone named Margaret Chen." Margaret Chen was 72 years old now, a woman who'd worked for my parents for 30 years, from when I was 7 until her retirement 2 years ago. I'd barely thought about Margaret in the context of this lawsuit, because we'd lost touch after she moved to Arizona to live with her daughter, and I had no idea Heather's legal team had found her until Eleanor mentioned the subpoena. Eleanor's investigator had tracked down Margaret's deposition transcript, and she handed it to me across her desk with an expression I couldn't quite read. What I found as I read through Margaret's testimony brought tears that I didn't bother wiping away, because they felt earned after months of holding everything together through force of will. Margaret described 3 decades of witnessing the foster family dynamics, with the particular clarity that comes from being present but invisible the way household staff often are to the families they serve. She detailed how I was consistently overlooked and criticized, while Heather was indulged and protected, how my mother would take my school awards and certificates and hide them in drawers while displaying Heather's participation ribbons prominently on the refrigerator. She remembered specific incidents I'd forgotten: the time I won a regional essay contest, and my mother told me not to brag about it because it would make Heather feel bad, or the birthday when I turned 13, and my parents forgot entirely because they were planning Heather's sweet 16 party that was still 3 years away. Most devastating, Margaret had witnessed the Thanksgiving incident that had started this entire chain of consequences. She'd stopped by that day to drop off a pumpkin pie, her annual contribution to the holiday, and had seen through the kitchen window as my mother handed me that dirty mop while Heather laughed and guests looked away in embarrassment. What I'd never known, what Margaret revealed in her deposition, was that she'd confronted my mother the next day, telling her that what she'd done was cruel and unacceptable. Margaret had threatened to quit after 30 years of loyal service if my parents didn't apologize to me and make things right. My mother's response, according to Margaret's sworn testimony, had been cold and dismissive. "Mind your own business, Margaret. This is a family matter and you're not family." Margaret had stayed on for 2 more months before retiring as planned, but she'd carried guilt about that moment ever since, wondering if she should have done more to defend me, or at least to let me know that someone had witnessed my humiliation and recognized it for what it was. But Margaret's deposition contained something far more significant than character testimony about family dynamics. 3 years ago, while cleaning my parents' home office on a Thursday afternoon, Margaret had witnessed Heather committing the fraud that had started this whole financial disaster. Heather had arrived unexpectedly while my parents were at a doctor's appointment, let herself in with her key, and spread refinancing documents across the desk in the office. Margaret, dusting the bookshelves, had watched as Heather pulled out a light box and old canceled checks, then carefully traced my father's signature onto the new mortgage paperwork with the precision of someone who'd practiced this forgery multiple times. When Margaret asked what she was doing, Heather had panicked visibly, then tried to buy her silence with an offer of $5,000 cash to "forget you saw anything here today." Margaret had refused the money but had stayed silent about what she'd witnessed, and her deposition explained why with the kind of practical fear that immigrants and working-class people understand intimately. She was terrified of losing her job at age 70 when finding new employment would be nearly impossible. She was worried about her work visa status, having originally emigrated from Taiwan and naturalized only 15 years ago, and she feared any involvement in legal matters might somehow jeopardize her citizenship. Most importantly, she desperately needed the health insurance that came with her employment, because her husband had diabetes, and their medications cost hundreds of dollars monthly, even with coverage. So she'd watched Heather commit fraud, said nothing, and lived with guilt that compounded over the following years. "I watched Heather steal from that family," her deposition read in the formal language of legal testimony, "and I said nothing because I was afraid for my own security. But I also watched Lindsay sacrifice everything for those people year after year and get nothing in return except criticism and dismissal. If my testimony can help Lindsay now, I'm ready to tell the truth, even if it means admitting I should have spoken up years ago when it might have prevented all this pain." Eleanor looked at me across her desk as I finished reading, and I could see the strategic calculations happening behind her eyes. "This changes everything," she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Margaret isn't just a character witness for you. She's direct evidence that Heather committed fraud, and more importantly, she confirms something I've suspected you knew about the forgery years ago, but chose not to report it." I nodded slowly, remembering the conversation I'd had with Margaret 2 years ago when she'd quietly pulled me aside during one of my rare visits to my parents' house and told me what she'd witnessed. She'd advised me to wait for the right time to address it, to gather evidence, to be strategic rather than reactive. That's why I'd documented everything, why I'd kept meticulous records, why I hadn't immediately reported Heather to the police despite having grounds to do so. I'd been giving my sister the chance to confess on her own, to take responsibility without legal consequences, to prove she was capable of doing the right thing. Eleanor's strategy crystallized as she explained her plan. "Heather's attorney has subpoenaed Margaret as a witness to testify about your character, probably expecting her to say something about how you were cold or distant with your parents. They have no idea what Margaret actually knows. We'll let Reeves question her first, let him ask about your character and your relationship with your family. Then on cross-examination, we'll reveal what she witnessed regarding Heather's fraud. It's risky because the judge might view it as trial by ambush, but Heather opened this door by making your character the central issue of this case. We're just walking through it with the truth. The trial began on a rainy Monday in April. I sat in that courtroom watching Heather play the victim with an actress's precision, and I wondered if the truth would be enough, or if she'd convince the world that I was the villain of this story. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with media representatives filling the back rows, and community members divided visibly into camps that had formed over the past months. Marcus sat directly behind me with Mrs. Henderson and 3 Grace Haven residents who'd insisted on coming to support me. While across the aisle, Heather's supporters were noticeably sparse, just a few friends who looked uncomfortable being there. Jonathan Reeves delivered his opening statement with the polished theatricality of someone who'd perfected this performance over decades, painting me as a calculating manipulator who'd used wealth and influence to control a dying woman. He displayed the fabricated text messages on a large screen where the jury could read them clearly, played the AI-generated voicemail that sounded just enough like me to be unsettling, and brought forward Heather's 2 friends who swore under oath they'd heard me making threats about my parents at a downtown restaurant. His closing flourish was delivered with the timing of an actor who knows exactly when to pause for maximum impact. Lindsay Foster is a successful businesswoman, yes, but success without compassion is just ambition, and ambition without love is cruelty. I watched several jurors nod their expressions sympathetic to Heather and felt my stomach tighten with the possibility that sophisticated lies might prevail over complicated truth. Eleanor's opening statement was quieter, more methodical, delivered without theatrical gestures or emotional manipulation. "This case isn't about who was the better daughter," she said, making eye contact with each juror individually. "It's about who told the truth and who committed fraud. By the end of this trial, you'll know the difference." She promised to present a witness who'd seen everything and had finally found the courage to speak, and I watched the jury lean forward slightly, their curiosity engaged by the mystery Eleanor was deliberately creating. When Reeves called Margaret Chen to the stand, he clearly expected testimony that would support his narrative of my coldness and neglect. Instead, Margaret provided measured, devastating testimony about 30 years of witnessing family dynamics that contradicted everything Heather's case depended on. Yes, she confirmed Lindsay was often absent from family gatherings, but she explained it was because I was working to pay bills they didn't know I was covering. Yes, Lindsay seemed emotionally distant, but Margaret's voice carried gentle reproach as she explained that after years of being dismissed and overlooked, emotional distance was self-protection rather than cruelty. When Reeves tried to suggest I'd manipulated my dying mother, Margaret's demeanor shifted from gentle to fierce. "That girl loved her mother even when her mother couldn't love her back," she said, looking directly at Reeves. "Don't you dare suggest otherwise." Then came Eleanor's cross-examination, and the entire tone of the courtroom shifted with a single question. "Mrs. Chen, during your 30 years working for the Foster family, did you ever witness Heather Foster commit any fraudulent acts?" The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet where you can hear people breathing. Margaret took a visible breath and described the signature forgery with precise detail. The Thursday afternoon 3 years ago, the light box, the traced signature, Heather's panic when she was discovered the attempted $5,000 bribe. Eleanor then introduced photographs of the forged documents that Margaret had quietly given me 2 years ago as insurance time-stamped and notarized evidence I'd been sitting on while hoping my sister would find the courage to confess on her own. The trial effectively ended in that moment. Reeves attempted damage control during his redirect examination, but the judge's expression had hardened, and the jury's body language had shifted away from Heather noticeably. Eleanor's closing argument was brief and pointed. Lindsay Foster had evidence of her sister's crime for 3 years. She could have sent Heather to prison. Instead, she stayed silent, hoping her sister would find redemption. That's not manipulation. That's mercy. But mercy was mistaken for weakness, and silence was mistaken for consent. Today, we correct that mistake. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes and returned with a verdict dismissing all claims against me. The judge went further, stating on the record that he was referring the matter to the prosecutor's office for potential fraud charges against Heather. As people filed out of the courtroom, Heather sat alone at the defendant's table, while her attorney packed his briefcase with obvious haste. I walked over to her and she looked up with mascara-streaked face. "I'm not going to ask them to prosecute you," I said quietly. "But you need to understand you did this to yourself. I didn't destroy your life, Heather. You did." She nodded slowly and whispered two words that sounded like they cost her everything. "I know." I left that courtroom thinking it was over. But the next morning I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before and a letter that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my father. The package arrived at my apartment the morning after the trial. Plain brown cardboard with no return address and my name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a photograph I'd never seen before me at 13 years old, standing beside my volcano science fair project, my face bright with the kind of pride that comes from achievement earned through actual effort. I remembered that day with painful clarity because neither of my parents had attended, claiming they had prior commitments they couldn't break, and I'd ridden the bus home alone, clutching my second-place ribbon and feeling the particular loneliness of success that no one witnesses. But examining the photograph more closely now, I noticed something in the background that made my breath catch. A man standing in the gymnasium doorway, partially obscured by other parents, but clearly watching me. And even in the grainy background, I recognized David Morrison from the photographs I'd seen in his trust fund documents. The letter accompanying the photo was from someone named Robert Chen, and halfway through the first paragraph, I realized with a shock of recognition that he was Margaret's nephew. The connections between the people who'd been protecting me suddenly forming a network I'd never known existed. Robert explained that he'd been David Morrison's business partner for 15 years, and that David had hired him for a very specific purpose: to document Lindsay's life from a distance, not to spy or intrude, but to bear witness to a daughter David couldn't publicly claim. Over 25 years, Robert had attended my school events with a camera, photographed my high school graduation from the back of the auditorium, captured images of my college acceptance celebration that I'd hosted for myself at a coffee shop, and even managed to get a shot of my first major business presentation when I was pitching Iron Leaf Care Group to potential investors. "Your father never missed a milestone," Robert wrote in careful handwriting. "He just made sure you never saw him there. Never knew he was watching because he believed his presence would cause more harm than his absence." But Robert's letter revealed something even more profound than photographic documentation. David Morrison had been actively supporting my life in ways I'd attributed to luck or merit or coincidence. The anonymous scholarship that had paid my final year of college tuition, the one from the Midwest Professional Women's Foundation, that I'd later discovered didn't actually exist. That was David channeling $23,000 through a shell organization he'd created specifically to help me without revealing himself. The startup grant that had helped me launch Iron Leaf Care Group when every bank had rejected my loan applications, dismissing a 25-year-old woman with big ideas, but no collateral. David's investment structured through a complex series of business entities that made it look like a legitimate grant program. Even the corporate contracts that had come my way in Iron Leaf's early days, the ones that had seemed almost too fortunate, too perfectly timed to save my struggling business. Robert explained that David had called in every professional favor he'd accumulated over decades in medical equipment sales, connecting me with decision-makers who became my first major clients. The revelations continued my college apartment, where the landlord had inexplicably never raised the rent for 4 years, keeping it affordable while every other unit in the building increased annually. David had been quietly subsidizing the difference, paying the landlord directly to maintain my rent at a rate I could manage on my part-time job income. He was terrified that if you knew about him, your mother's family would completely reject you. Robert wrote his words carrying the weight of conversations he'd clearly had with David many times. He thought being an invisible guardian was better than being the reason you lost even the broken family you had. He didn't want his presence to become another weapon they could use against you. The package contained one final item that Robert's letter prepared me for, But that still devastated me when I actually watched it, a video recording on a thumb drive, dated 6 weeks before David Morrison's death from pancreatic cancer in 2003. I plugged it into my laptop with shaking hands and watched my biological father appear on screen, sitting in what looked like a home office, his frame thin from illness, but his eyes remarkably warm and focused. "Lindsay," he began, and hearing him say my name in his own voice, rather than through written letters, felt like being recognized by someone I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and you finally know the truth about who I was to you. I want to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry that I never had the courage to claim you as my daughter while I was alive. I told myself I was protecting you from the complications my presence would create. But maybe I was just protecting myself from your mother's anger, and from the rejection of the man who raised you." He spoke for nearly 15 minutes, his voice occasionally breaking with emotion as he described watching me grow up from the shadows, feeling pride mixed with grief at every milestone. "I've watched you become an extraordinary woman despite every obstacle placed in your path," he said, leaning closer to the camera as if trying to bridge the years between his recording and my eventual viewing. "You have my determination and your mother's intelligence, but you have something neither of us had: integrity. You don't compromise who you are for anyone's comfort, and that's a rare quality that will serve you better than any inheritance I could leave. That's why I set up that trust fund, not to replace a father's presence, but to give you freedom from people who couldn't see your worth. Whatever you do with your life, whatever choices you make, know that you were loved. You were always loved, even when you couldn't see it." I sat in my apartment watching that video on a loop, crying for the father I never knew, and realizing that I'd been looking for love in the wrong places all along. Then my phone rang. It was Heather, and she said something I never expected to hear. Heather's voice on the phone sounded completely different from any version of her I'd heard before, stripped of all defensiveness and performance, raw, with an emotion that seemed to come from somewhere genuine rather than calculated. "I need to see you," she said without preamble when I answered. "Not to ask for anything, not to defend myself, just to talk. Please, Lindsay." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop neither of us had been to before, a neutral territory in a small town roughly halfway between my apartment and wherever Heather was living now. When I arrived, I barely recognized the woman sitting in the corner booth. She'd lost weight, not in the carefully managed way she used to diet before social events, but in the way people do when they're too stressed or sad to remember to eat properly. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no professional styling, and she wore no makeup, just jeans and an old sweater that looked like it might have been our father's. She looked diminished, but somehow more real than I'd ever seen her. She started speaking before I'd fully settled into my seat, as if she'd been rehearsing these words and feared losing them if she waited. "I read your father's letters," she said, and the possessive pronoun she used, your, rather than our, told me immediately which father she meant. I felt my body go rigid, my hands gripping my coffee cup. "What? How did you—" Heather interrupted gently, which was unusual enough that I stopped talking. "After the trial, Dad gave them to me. The man who raised us both, I mean. He thought I should understand what you'd been dealing with all these years, what it meant to be the secret nobody wanted to acknowledge. So I read them, all 27 of them, sitting up all night in his apartment, understanding for the first time that you weren't the difficult daughter who couldn't fit in. You were the secret daughter, the living reminder of shame, the child whose very existence threatened everything Mom had built." Her apology when it came was nothing like the previous attempts I'd witnessed in courtrooms, or through lawyers, or in desperate text messages. This one had no excuses woven through it, no justifications or attempts to spread blame. "I knew you weren't Dad's biological daughter since I was 16 years old," she said, her voice steady despite the tears starting to track down her face. "And I let that knowledge poison everything between us. I told myself I was keeping the secret to protect the family, to prevent some terrible unraveling that would hurt everyone. But really, I was keeping it to protect my status as the real daughter, the legitimate one, the one who belonged without question. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so unpolished, it was almost jarring coming from someone who'd always been so careful about appearances. Every accomplishment you had threatened my position. Every time Mom and Dad compared us, I felt like I had to win, because if you were better than me, despite not being Dad's biological child, what did that say about their choice to favor me? What did it say about my worth? Heather described years of cognitive dissonance that I recognized from my own experience of living in our family's dysfunction, though from a completely different angle. She'd watched me succeed while treating me terribly had stolen from our parents, while I'd been supporting them invisibly, and had felt simultaneously superior and deeply inferior in ways that drove her to increasingly desperate acts. The fraud, the refinancing, all of it was me trying to prove I was worth something when I felt fundamentally worthless, she admitted. If I could tear you down financially, if I could prove you weren't as capable as you seemed, then maybe the lie I'd been living with would feel less heavy. And I almost destroyed everyone in the process, including myself, especially myself. For 2 hours, we sat in that coffee shop talking with an honesty that had never existed between us in 37 years of being sisters. Heather told me about the intensive therapy she'd started sessions 3 times a week with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and the psychological damage of secret keeping. She'd filed for bankruptcy last month, her credit destroyed, and her assets liquidated to pay debts she'd accumulated, trying to maintain an image of success she couldn't afford. She was living with our father now in his small 2-bedroom apartment, sleeping on a futon in what used to be a home office, and she'd taken a job at a grocery store stocking shelves and working the register to earn money and rebuild some sense of honest work. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, looking directly at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I know I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I'd even know what to do with it if you offered it. But I want you to know that I finally understand what I took from you all those years of being seen, of being valued, of being treated like you belonged. And I understand what you never took from me, despite having every reason and every opportunity to destroy me completely." We cried together. Then not the tears of joyful reconciliation you see in movies, but the tears of shared recognition that we'd both been casualties of the same toxic secret, just wounded in different ways. As we left the coffee shop, the winter sun setting early and casting long shadows across the parking lot, Heather said something that genuinely surprised me. "I want to volunteer at Grace Haven," she said, her voice tentative. "Not in any public way where my presence might hurt your mission or make the residents uncomfortable, but maybe cleaning, organizing supplies in the storage room, whatever behind-the-scenes work you need. I want to do the work I should have been doing all along instead of tearing you down." 3 days later, Heather showed up at Grace Haven at 6 a.m. with cleaning supplies and a mop. And for the first time in our lives, we worked side by side, not as rivals but as 2 women trying to sweep away the past. 6 weeks after the trial, my phone rang with a number I'd kept in my contacts, but hadn't expected to see on my screen. John Foster, the man who'd raised me, the only father I'd ever known despite not sharing his blood. His voice on the phone was hesitant, almost formal, as he asked if he could visit me at Grace Haven. He'd never seen the facility, had never acknowledged what I'd built from the ashes of our family's dysfunction, and the request surprised me enough that I agreed before fully considering whether I was ready for whatever conversation he wanted to have. When he arrived on a cold afternoon in late April, I barely recognized him as the man who'd sat in his recliner making dismissive comments about my lack of husband and children. He looked older than his 69 years, moving with a pronounced limp from arthritis that I knew he could no longer afford to treat properly since I'd stopped managing his health care. His face was deeply lined in ways that went beyond simple aging, carved with what looked like regret or grief or some combination of emotions he'd probably never learned to name. I gave him a tour of Grace Haven without commentary, letting the space speak for itself. He walked slowly through the renovated house, seeing the 4 small apartments where women were actively rebuilding their lives after escaping situations remarkably similar to what I'd experienced, though their abuse had been more obviously financial rather than the subtle emotional kind our family had specialized in. He observed the community kitchen where residents cooked together, sharing meals and stories, and the kind of support that comes from people who understand what it means to start over. He spent a long time in the small library I'd created, running his fingers along spines of books about healing from family trauma, recovering from financial abuse, and building self-worth independent of other people's validation. Then he stopped in front of the wooden plaque hanging in the living room, the one that read, "You are not what they said you were," in carved letters that Marcus had commissioned from a local artisan. He touched it gently, almost reverently, and stood there for so long I thought he might not speak at all. Finally he turned to me with tears in his eyes and said, "I need to tell you something I should have said 37 years ago." We sat in my small office, the one I'd created from what used to be a storage closet, and John Foster spoke truths that I'd suspected but never heard confirmed. "I knew you weren't biologically mine before you were born," he began. His hands clasped tightly in his lap as if holding himself together through force of will. "Your mother came to me pregnant and terrified, and I made a choice to raise you as my own. At the time, I thought I was being Noble, the good man who stood by his girlfriend despite her mistake. I thought people would admire my character, my willingness to take on another man's child. But nobility without love is just pride wearing a costume. And I had so much pride, Lindsay. So much toxic, destructive pride that I couldn't see what I was doing to an innocent child." He described decades of internal conflict with the kind of self-awareness that suggested he'd been thinking about this for years, probably in therapy of his own, that he'd never mentioned to anyone. He'd resented me for existing while simultaneously knowing that resentment was fundamentally unjust, and the cognitive dissonance had manifested as coldness and distance. He'd taken out his anger at my mother's infidelity on me, the visible evidence of her betrayal, because punishing her directly would have required him to acknowledge his own pain and vulnerability. He'd favored Heather because she was truly his in a biological sense that I never could be, and that favoritism had made him feel like he had control over at least one aspect of a situation where he'd felt fundamentally powerless. "Every time I looked at you, I saw her betrayal rather than seeing you as a separate person who deserved love regardless of your origins," he said, his voice breaking on the word love. "And I punished you for it. I treated you like you were less than Heather, like you had to earn belonging that should have been freely given because it made me feel like I had some power in a marriage where I'd been cuckolded and had agreed to raise the evidence of that humiliation." The confession continued with painful honesty. He admitted that watching me succeed despite his coldness had made him even more resentful because it suggested I didn't need him, which wounded his ego in ways he couldn't articulate at the time. He described feeling threatened by my competence and independence because they reminded him of his own inadequacy as a parent. "You were never the problem, Lindsay," he said, looking at me directly, for perhaps the first time in my memory, without some layer of dismissal or judgment in his expression. "I was the problem. My pride, my inability to separate you from my pain about your mother, my choice to protect my ego instead of protecting a child who needed a father. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate after 37 years, but I'm profoundly, desperately sorry for every moment I made you feel like you didn't belong." I listened to this apology feeling a complicated tangle of emotions that I didn't try to sort or simplify. There was anger for the little girl who'd needed protection and received coldness. Instead, sadness for the man who'd chosen pride over love and wasted decades in that choice, and a strange, unexpected compassion for the very human struggle to be better than our worst impulses when those impulses are deeply rooted in pain we don't know how to process. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not because you don't deserve the possibility of forgiveness, but because I'm still figuring out how to forgive the people who hurt me. I don't know what forgiveness looks like when someone has damaged your entire childhood and early adulthood. I don't know if it's even possible to fully forgive that kind of foundational betrayal." John nodded, accepting this without argument or defensiveness. which was itself remarkable given how he'd spent my entire life defending his choices through deflection and blame. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made my breath catch: the family portrait from my college graduation, the one where my face had been carefully cut away. "I took this from your mother's things after she died," he said, unfolding the photograph with careful hands. "I was going through her jewelry box looking for your grandmother's ring to give to Heather, and I found this tucked in the bottom." He handed me a small piece of photograph, roughly oval-shaped, showing my 8-year-old face, smiling at a camera with the kind of hope that breaks my heart to see now. She'd kept it all these years hidden where no one would find it. She couldn't throw it away. "None of us could really erase you no matter how hard we tried. You were always there, always fighting, always surviving, despite everything we did to diminish you. And you became someone better than all of us combined." As my father left that day, walking slowly back to his borrowed car with his arthritic limp, he turned back and said something that would haunt me. "Margaret was more of a parent to you than I ever was. If you can forgive anyone in this story, forgive her. She loved you when we couldn't." 2 weeks after my father's visit, Margaret Chen appeared at Grace Haven carrying a small wooden box that looked like it had been crafted with care, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. She found me in the community kitchen helping one of the residents prepare dinner, and the expression on her face told me this wasn't a casual visit. We went to my office, and she set the box on my desk with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, was an old cassette tape in a clear plastic case labeled in my mother's handwriting, "For Lindsay when she's ready." Margaret explained with gentle precision that in the final weeks of my mother's life, during the period when I wasn't visiting regularly because I couldn't bear to watch her die while still carrying so much unresolved pain, my mother had asked Margaret to help her record messages. "She was too weak to write by then," Margaret said quietly. "Her hands shook too much to hold a pen for more than a few seconds. But she knew you might not come back, and she had things she needed to say. So she talked into this recorder whenever she had enough energy, sometimes just for 5 minutes before exhausting herself." Margaret had kept the tape for months after my mother's death, uncertain about when the right time would be, afraid of causing me more pain when I was already drowning in it. "I think now is that time," she said, placing an old cassette player beside the wooden box, the kind of technology that belonged to a different era but that apparently my mother had specifically requested because she wanted her words preserved in a format that felt permanent and deliberate. "Listen when you're alone, Lindsay, and remember as you listen that she was human, broken and deeply flawed, but human. None of us get through life without failing the people we should have protected." That night, I sat in my apartment with the cassette player on my coffee table, staring at it for nearly an hour before finding the courage to press play. When I finally did, my mother's voice emerged thin and reedy from illness, but unmistakably hers, carrying inflections and patterns I'd heard my entire life. "Lindsay, if you're listening to this, I'm gone, and you're probably still angry with me. You should be. You have every right to rage at what I did to you. I'm recording this because I need to tell you things I couldn't say to your face. Things I'm too ashamed to admit while looking in your eyes and seeing the damage I caused reflected back at me." For 47 minutes, I sat frozen on my couch listening to my mother's confession, which was more comprehensive and honest than anything she'd managed while alive. The affair with David Morrison wasn't the one-night mistake she'd implied in her written letter, but a genuine love affair that had lasted 3 months and made her question everything about the life she'd planned. "He was kind in ways I'd never experienced," her voice said through the old speakers. "He saw me as more than a future wife or potential mother. He saw me as a complete person with thoughts and dreams that mattered independent of my relationships. When I realized I was pregnant, he wanted us to leave together to start over somewhere new where no one knew our history. But I was terrified. Terrified of disappointing my parents, terrified of financial insecurity, terrified of being judged by everyone I'd ever known. So I chose security over love, and I made John raise another man's child to maintain that security and respectability." My mother described the cost of that choice with clarity she'd apparently gained only in facing death. She couldn't love me the way I deserved because every time she showed me affection, John would withdraw from both of us, punishing her through me. So I trained myself not to see you, not to feel for you, she said, her voice breaking. I taught myself to view you as a problem to be managed, rather than a child to be cherished. It was the cruelest thing I've ever done, and I did it to protect myself from my husband's resentment and from my own guilt. Every time I looked at you, I saw my own cowardice reflected back. The apology that followed was different from every other attempt she'd made, stripped of the defensive justifications and requests for understanding that had characterized our hospital conversations. You were an extraordinary child who deserved an extraordinary mother, and I gave you fragments of myself at best, she said with devastating honesty. I treated you like a burden when you were a blessing. I let Heather hurt you to maintain a lie that was destroying all of us. I handed you a mop when I should have handed you my heart. I tore your face out of photographs because I couldn't face my own failures, and in doing so, I tried to erase evidence of your existence rather than celebrating it. Her voice cracked as she continued the recording, capturing the sound of her struggle to breathe between sentences. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Lindsay. I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not sure I could accept it even if you offered it. I'm just asking you to know that I finally see what I did. I see you now, all of you, and you're magnificent. You're everything I could have been if I'd had your courage to choose truth over comfort, integrity over security. You built a life of meaning from the wreckage of a childhood I destroyed, and that's entirely your doing, not mine. The tape ended with my mother's whispered final words barely audible over the hiss of old recording technology. You deserved better than me. I hope you find people who love you the way David Morrison did, completely honestly, without shame or reservation. And I hope someday you can look back on your childhood and see that even in our cruelty we couldn't completely destroy the light inside you. That light was all yours, Lindsay. We didn't give it to you through any nurturing or support. We couldn't take it away despite our best efforts to diminish it. It was always just yours, burning steady through everything we did to extinguish it. I played that tape 3 times, crying through each listening with different layers of emotion emerging. Anger first, then grief, then something approaching understanding that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was softer than rage. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I drove to the cemetery, and for the first time I talked to my mother. Not the woman who hurt me, but the broken human who did her best and failed. After visiting my mother's grave and finding an unexpected peace in speaking truths to the earth that covered her, I decided to fully commit to Grace Haven by moving into the small apartment we'd created above the facility. While organizing my storage unit to prepare for the move, sorting through boxes I'd packed hastily after Thanksgiving and never properly unpacked, I found something that stopped me cold: the mop from that Thanksgiving night. I'd grabbed it on my way out of my parents' house without conscious thought, simply picked it up from where I'd set it down and carried it with me into the snow. It had been in my car trunk for months, forgotten beneath emergency supplies and reusable grocery bags, a relic of the worst night of my life that I'd unconsciously preserved. Looking at it now with 6 months of distance and transformation, I saw it completely differently. It wasn't a weapon that had been used against me, though it had certainly been intended that way. It was evidence of what I'd survived, proof that I'd walked away from humiliation and built something meaningful from that moment of profound dismissal. The wooden handle was worn smooth from years of use, the kind of wear that comes from honest work done repeatedly without recognition or praise. The mop head was stained and frayed, its fibers compressed from cleaning floors that probably never appreciated the labor that went into maintaining them. Looking at this object, I realized it was a perfect metaphor for how my family had viewed me, a tool for their comfort valued only for utility, expected to clean up their messes while remaining invisible. But I was done being invisible. I drove to a woodworking shop on the east side of Indianapolis that Marcus had recommended, run by a woman named Sarah, who'd survived domestic violence and had been one of Grace Haven's earliest and most generous donors, despite never having lived there herself. When I walked in carrying the mop and explained what I wanted, Sarah's eyes filled with immediate understanding. "You want to preserve this," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of shared knowledge between women who understood the power of reclaiming symbols. "You want to make it permanent so it can't be forgotten or dismissed." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she took the mop from my hands with the reverence it deserved. 3 weeks later, Sarah called me to pick up the finished piece, and when I saw what she'd created, I wept in her workshop. She'd constructed a shadow box frame from reclaimed wood, mounting the mop vertically at the center with museum-quality preservation techniques that would protect it for decades. Around the frame's border, she'd engraved quotes that she'd collected from Grace Haven residents, women who'd found strength in unexpected places and wanted to share their wisdom. They tried to diminish me with their tools of shame, but I built a throne from their insults. Read one line in elegant script. The mop was meant to put me in my place. Instead, it cleaned away the lies, declared another. Sarah presented the installation to me with a small card tucked into the corner that read, "Every weapon formed against you becomes a tool for your liberation." I hung the installation in Grace Haven's main entrance, positioned so that every woman who walked through our doors would see it immediately, a testament to transformation and the refusal to accept diminishment. Beneath the shadow box, I mounted a brass plaque with words that Marcus had helped me craft. "Sometimes the instruments of our humiliation become the monuments of our survival." The residents gathered for an informal unveiling, and several of them cried when they understood the story behind it, seeing their own journeys reflected in this preserved symbol of shame transformed into art. A local photographer named Jennifer, who'd been documenting Grace Haven for a feature story in Indianapolis Monthly, took a photograph of the installation with afternoon light streaming through the window behind it, creating an almost ethereal glow around the preserved mop. She posted it on her professional Instagram account with a caption explaining its significance, and within 48 hours, the image had gone viral in ways none of us anticipated. It wasn't the Thanksgiving drama that captured people's attention this time, but the universal symbolism of taking what was meant to break you and turning it into evidence of your strength. The image was shared millions of times across social media platforms with captions like, "When they try to break you, turn their weapons into art," and "She was handed a mop to remind her of her place. She built a museum." My inbox flooded with messages from women around the world sharing their own versions of mop stories, moments when they'd been handed symbols of their supposed worthlessness and had transformed them into sources of power. A domestic violence survivor from Oregon sent me a photograph of a cast-iron frying pan that her ex-husband had used to hit her, now welded into a sculpture that stood in her garden as a reminder of what she'd survived and overcome. A woman who'd been unjustly fired from her corporate job after reporting harassment sent me an image of her termination letter, professionally framed and hanging next to her new business license, the two documents telling a story of institutional failure and personal triumph. A teenager whose parents had thrown away her college acceptance letters because they wanted her to work in the family business, instead sent me a photo of those retrieved letters, now preserved under glass in her dorm room at the university she'd attended anyway. The mop became accidentally iconic, a symbol that transcended my personal story, and connected to something deeper in the collective experience of women who'd been told they were less than they were. Grace Haven evolved from a local transitional housing facility into something larger, a movement about transforming shame into power and refusing to let other people's cruelty define your worth. We started receiving donation requests from other cities wanting to replicate our model, and speaking invitations arrived asking me to talk about the journey from humiliation to empowerment. The mop was supposed to remind me of my place. Instead, it became a reminder that our worth isn't determined by those who try to diminish us, it's proven by what we build from their attempts. 6 months after Grace Haven opened its doors, I received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference in Chicago, and my immediate instinct was to decline. Public speaking had never been my strength, and I worried about being reduced to the Thanksgiving mop woman, my entire professional life, and everything I'd built overshadowed by one viral moment of family dysfunction. But Marcus sat in my office and made a compelling case. "Your story isn't about revenge," he said, leaning forward with the intensity he brought to arguments he considered important. "It's about boundaries. It's about the invisible labor that women perform and the exploitation that happens when families take that labor for granted. Women need to hear that they're allowed to walk away from people who diminish them even when those people are family. So I accepted spending weeks drafting and redrafting a speech I titled, "The Price of Invisible Labor," trying to find words that honored the complexity of what I'd experienced, without either minimizing the pain or wallowing in victimhood. The conference took place in a downtown Chicago hotel ballroom filled with 800 women, and standing at that podium looking out at their expectant faces, I felt more vulnerable than I had in any courtroom or press conference. I spoke for 35 minutes about being the family's financial backbone, while being treated as its disappointment about the particular vulnerability of women who sacrifice everything for families that exploit them without acknowledgement or gratitude. I talked about the difference between forgiveness and allowing abuse to continue, about how walking away from toxicity isn't abandonment, but self-preservation. I described the invisible labor that so many women perform, the emotional management, the financial support, the crisis intervention that goes unrecognized, because it's expected rather than appreciated. When I finished, the silence lasted just long enough to make me worry I'd misjudged everything, and then the entire audience rose to their feet in an ovation that continued for 7 minutes while I stood there crying and trying to understand that these women saw themselves in my story. Afterward, dozens of women approached me with their own experiences that echoed mine in devastating ways. A woman in her 50s told me about supporting her parents financially for 15 years, while her brother, who contributed nothing, remained the favorite child who got praised at every family gathering. A younger woman described covering her sister's repeated financial crises while being blamed for not doing enough when she finally set boundaries. A wife explained how she'd been funding her husband's extended family for a decade while being treated like an outsider at family events. Each story was different in its specifics, but identical in its core: women who gave everything and received nothing but criticism in return. The success of that speech and the connections it created gave me the courage to expand Grace Haven beyond its original single location. Using funds from David Morrison's trust combined with private donations that had been flooding in since the mop installation went viral, I opened 2 additional facilities within 8 months, one in Fort Wayne serving the northeastern part of Indiana, and another in South Bend, reaching women in the northern corridor. Each facility followed the same model, offering women over 40 who were rebuilding after financial abuse, family exploitation, or late-life divorce, a structured program of support. 6 months of free housing in private apartments, job training tailored to their skills and interests, financial literacy classes that taught them to protect themselves from future exploitation, and therapy, both individual and group, to process the trauma they'd survived. I hired Margaret Chen as our organization's cultural consultant and family dynamics advisor, a role that utilized her 3 decades of witnessing family dysfunction from the unique vantage point of household staff who see everything but are expected to say nothing. Margaret brought wisdom about the patterns of family abuse that transcend culture and class, and she trained our staff to recognize the subtle signs of emotional manipulation that often accompany financial exploitation. Heather, true to her word, volunteered regularly at all 3 facilities, though never in public-facing roles where her presence might complicate residents' healing or damage Grace Haven's reputation. Instead, she worked in the essential background, managing supply inventories across locations, organizing donation drives, deep cleaning apartments between residents with a thoroughness that suggested penance through labor. I noticed that she arrived early and left late, working with a quiet diligence that spoke louder than any apology could. We weren't close, perhaps we never would be, but we were building something together that felt more valuable than sisterhood, mutual respect earned through shared purpose. The national conversation that emerged from Grace Haven's visibility surprised me with its breadth and intensity. Major publications began covering what they called family financial abuse, a term most people hadn't encountered before, but that resonated immediately with readers who'd experienced it. The New York Times ran a profile titled "The Woman Who Turned Humiliation into Housing," and NPR's Hidden Brain produced an episode about invisible labor in families that became one of their most downloaded shows of the year. Psychology. Today published research quantifying what many women already knew. Instinctively, adult children, especially daughters, provide an average of $50,000 in financial support to parents over their lifetimes, often while being emotionally undervalued and treated as less successful than siblings who contribute nothing. The attention led to an unexpected invitation. Indiana state legislators asked me to consult on proposed legislation that would create legal protections for adult children experiencing family financial exploitation. I testified before the state legislature describing the mechanisms by which families manipulate and exploit their most generous members, and arguing for legal frameworks that would allow adult children to protect their assets without completely severing family ties. The bill didn't pass in its first session, too controversial and too complicated for legislators worried about being accused of undermining family values, but the conversation had begun. I realized that my role wasn't to fix everything or to create perfect solutions, but to make the invisible visible and to give voice to women who'd been silent about family dysfunction for too long. 1 year after that Thanksgiving dinner, I received an invitation that would bring everything full circle. My father wanted to host Thanksgiving at Grace Haven with Heather, Margaret, and me. And he wanted to cook. When my father called to propose hosting Thanksgiving at Grace Haven, I agreed, but with conditions that I stated clearly and without apology. There would be no media, no performance for outsiders, no guests beyond the small group of people who actually constituted whatever family meant to us now. Everyone would participate equally in preparation, and there would be space for honest conversation without any obligation to perform gratitude we didn't genuinely feel. My father accepted these terms without argument, which was itself remarkable, given how our family had historically operated. He arrived at Grace Haven the day before Thanksgiving, carrying grocery bags and wearing an expression of humility I'd never seen on him in 69 years. Over the past year, he'd learned to cook not elaborate meals, but simple, honest food, prepared with the kind of care that suggested he was trying to learn a new language of love when words had failed him for so long. Heather arrived early to help prep vegetables, and I watched her methodically chop onions and celery, with a focus that suggested she found comfort in the rhythm of useful work. Margaret appeared with her famous pumpkin pie, the same one she'd brought to my parents' house every Thanksgiving for 30 years, and seeing it felt like a thread of continuity connecting past to present without requiring us to pretend the past had been good. We worked in Grace Haven's community kitchen alongside 3 current residents who'd chosen to stay for the holiday rather than face their own complicated families. Sarah was rebuilding after her husband had financially abused her for 15 years. Patricia was recovering from her adult children's exploitation of her retirement savings. Keisha was healing from a family that had used her paycheck while treating her like a failure for not achieving more. The atmosphere in that kitchen was tentative but genuine, less like a Hallmark movie, and more like a group of wounded people choosing to occupy the same space, despite histories that gave them every reason to avoid each other. We gathered around the large dining table in Grace Haven's common room as evening light faded outside the windows, 7 people who wouldn't have been in the same room a year ago. Me, my father, Heather, Margaret, and the 3 residents whose presence somehow made everything feel less performative and more real. Before eating, I suggested something different from the traditional gratitude recitation that had always felt forced in my family. Instead of saying what we're thankful for, I proposed let's each share something we're working on forgiving either in ourselves or in others. My father went first, his voice steady but emotional. I'm working on forgiving myself for the years I can't get back with Lindsay, for choosing pride over love and letting that choice define decades of our relationship. Heather followed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I'm working on forgiving the person I was, the one who hurt people to make herself feel better, who stole and lied and justified it all through twisted logic. Margaret spoke next, her accented English, carrying wisdom earned through witnessing. I'm working on forgiving my own silence when I witnessed injustice. I told myself I was protecting my job and my family, but I was also protecting myself from the discomfort of speaking truth. The 3 residents shared their own struggles with forgiveness. Sarah working to forgive herself for staying too long in an abusive marriage, Patricia forgiving her children while maintaining necessary boundaries. Keisha forgiving her family enough to move forward without forgetting what they'd done. When it was my turn, I paused for a long moment, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. I'm working on forgiving the little girl inside me who still wants her parents to be perfect, I said quietly. And I'm working on accepting that loving people doesn't mean trusting them, that those two things can exist separately, and that's okay. After dinner, as we moved into the cleanup phase with everyone helping in the natural division of labor that happens when people genuinely want to contribute, Heather asked if she could say something. She walked to the cleaning closet and pulled out a mop, a new one from our regular supplies, and held it with visible awkwardness. Last year my cruelty was handing you this as an insult, she said, looking at me directly. This year I want to... She faltered, tears starting to track down her face. I want to ask if we can clean up together, as equals, as women who both have work to do. I walked over and took one end of the mop handle while Heather held the other, and we cleaned the kitchen floor side by side without speaking, our movements gradually finding a rhythm. Margaret began humming an old Taiwanese lullaby, something she used to sing when I was a child and she thought no one was listening. A melody that had been one of the few sources of tenderness in my childhood. It wasn't a dramatic moment of reconciliation with swelling music and tearful embraces. It was just two sisters mopping a floor together, which was somehow more meaningful than any grand gesture could have been because it was real and unglamorous and required both of us to do actual work rather than perform emotion. The Grace Haven residents watched this from where they were drying dishes and putting away leftovers, and I could see in their faces that they understood what they were witnessing. Healing doesn't look like forgiveness speeches delivered with perfect words. It looks like showing up despite pain, doing ordinary work alongside people who've hurt you, choosing presence over abandonment, even when absence would be easier. As everyone prepared to leave that night, my father approached me in the entrance hall where the preserved mop hung in its shadow box frame. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope that looked old, its edges softened from handling. "This is the final letter from David Morrison," he said quietly. "One I didn't give you with the others because he specified when it should be delivered. He wanted you to have this after your first Thanksgiving without them, meaning without your mother and me treating you the way we did. I think now counts." I climbed the stairs to my apartment above Grace Haven with the envelope clutched in my hand, feeling the weight of final words from a father I'd never known but who'd apparently known me better than the people who raised me. The apartment was quiet and dark except for the glow of streetlights filtering through the windows, and I sat on my couch for several minutes, just holding the letter, preparing myself for whatever truth it contained. When I finally opened it, David Morrison's handwriting was shakier than in his previous letters. The evidence of illness progressing toward its inevitable conclusion, but his words were clear and purposeful. "Lindsay, if you're reading this, you've survived whatever Thanksgiving looked like without me watching from the shadows," he began, and I felt tears start immediately because he'd understood that Thanksgiving would be significant, that the holiday of supposed gratitude would be where my family's dysfunction would crystallize into something I could no longer ignore. "I hope it was peaceful. I hope you're surrounded by people who know your worth and celebrate it freely. But if you're alone as you read this, I want you to know something important. Loneliness after leaving toxic people isn't failure, it's freedom. You may have lost the family you were born into, but you'll build the family you deserve, one person at a time, one honest relationship at a time, one act of genuine love at a time." He continued with observations that felt like he'd been watching not just my external life, but my internal struggles. "I spent your entire life watching you be strong for people who took your strength for granted, who demanded your resilience while never acknowledging the cost of maintaining it. I want you to know that strength doesn't always look like endurance. Sometimes strength looks like walking away from people who hurt you. Sometimes it looks like crying when you need to cry. Sometimes it looks like admitting you're tired and letting yourself rest. Give yourself permission to be human, not just strong. You've earned the right to be imperfect and still worthy of love." The letter ended with a blessing that felt more powerful than any I'd received from the people who'd claimed to be my family. "Whatever you build with your life, know that you're already enough. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. You don't have to earn love through sacrifice or achievement. You simply are, and that's sufficient. I'm proud of you not for what you've accomplished, but for who you are despite everything that tried to break you. You carry my DNA, but you created your own spirit, and that spirit is magnificent. I read the letter 3 times each reading, revealing new layers of understanding about what it means to be seen by someone who has no agenda except wanting you to thrive. Then I set it carefully on my coffee table next to the other letters David Morrison had written, 28 letters now spanning my entire life, and I let myself cry with a release that felt different from previous tears. This wasn't grief or anger or even relief. It was recognition that I'd been loved more faithfully from a distance than I'd ever been loved up close, and that knowledge changed something fundamental in how I understood my own story. The next afternoon, as I was updating Grace Haven's resident files and planning the week's programming, the doorbell rang with the particular insistence that suggests someone who needs to be heard. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-60s, well-dressed in a way that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. "My name is Carolyn Morrison," she said, and the surname made my heart stop. "I was your father's partner. We were together the last 5 years of his life. We couldn't marry because he was so focused on protecting your inheritance and didn't want any legal complications, but we built a life together, and he asked me to find you when the time was right." She pulled out a photograph from her purse, and I saw David Morrison at what looked like a Christmas party, his arm around this woman, both of them smiling with the ease of people who are genuinely happy rather than performing happiness for cameras. "He talked about you constantly," Carolyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every achievement you had, every article written about your company, every piece of evidence that you were thriving despite the family that failed you. He collected it all, and he made me promise that if you ever needed anything at all, I would be there to help because he couldn't be." I invited her inside, and we spent 3 hours in Grace Haven's small sitting room, talking about David Morrison not as the abstract biological father or the ghost who'd watched from shadows, but as a real man with quirks and habits and daily routines. Carolyn told me he loved baseball with an irrational passion that he couldn't cook anything beyond scrambled eggs without somehow creating a disaster, that he volunteered at homeless shelters every Sunday morning because he believed everyone deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. She showed me photographs on her phone David at charity fundraisers looking uncomfortable in formal wear. David with Habitat for Humanity wearing a tool belt, and grinning David sitting in what looked like their living room holding a framed photograph that I recognized as my college graduation picture printed from a newspaper announcement. "He was so proud of you," Carolyn whispered, her eyes filling with tears that matched my own. "He'd set up Google alerts for your name and Iron Leaf Care Group, and he'd read every single article, every mention, every review. When you won that community service award 3 years ago, he printed the article and carried it in his wallet until the paper wore thin. He died knowing you'd be okay, better than okay. He died knowing you were the best of both your parents, taking their strengths and rejecting their weaknesses." As Carolyn prepared to leave, she pulled one final item from her bag, a small frame containing a photograph I recognized as the one from my 8th grade science fair, the one where David had been watching from the gymnasium doorway. But this was a different copy, and on the back, in his handwriting, he'd written, "My daughter who I watched but couldn't hold. May she find the family she deserves." Carolyn pressed it into my hands and hugged me with a fierceness that suggested she'd been holding this embrace for him. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she said against my hair. "You never were. You just couldn't see all the people loving you from the wings, protecting you in the only ways they could." After she left, I stood in Grace Haven's entrance hall looking at the preserved mop in its shadow box frame, at the plaque beneath it reading, "Sometimes the instruments of our humiliation become the monuments of our survival." Behind me, I could hear the sounds of women moving through the building, residents preparing dinner in the community kitchen, someone laughing in one of the apartments, The ordinary sounds of people rebuilding their lives in a space designed to hold them safely while they figured out who they were apart from the people who'd defined them through diminishment. Outside the windows, snow had begun to fall in the particular way it does in late November in Indiana, soft and persistent and transforming everything it touches. That evening I opened my journal, the leather-bound book I'd been writing in every night since last Thanksgiving, and I reflected on everything that had changed in 1 year. A year ago, my family handed me a mop and told me to know my place. I wrote in the careful handwriting that had become my meditation practice. Today, I understand they were right about one thing: I needed to know my place. But my place isn't at their feet serving their comfort while erasing my own needs. My place is here building homes for women who, like me, were told they were worthless by the very people who should have treasured them. My place is being the person I needed when I was younger, and no one showed up to be that person for me. My place is proving that your value doesn't come from family approval or anyone else's validation. It comes from the life you build when you stop seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. I looked out at Grace Haven at the warm lights glowing in 4 apartments where women were starting over at the community spaces we'd created, where healing happened through ordinary moments rather than dramatic gestures. Then I wrote one final line that felt like both an ending and a beginning. They gave me a mop to diminish me. Instead, I used it to sweep away everything that wasn't real, and I found myself underneath. I closed the journal and sat in the quiet of my apartment, feeling something I hadn't felt in 37 years settle into my bones. It wasn't happiness exactly, because healing from family trauma doesn't result in simple happiness. It was something deeper and more sustainable: peace. And for the first time in 37 years, when I whispered, "I'm home," I finally meant it. And so we reach the end of Lindsay's journey. A story that began with humiliation at a Thanksgiving dinner and transformed into something far greater than revenge or vindication. What started as one woman being handed a mop and told to know her place became a movement about reclaiming dignity, setting boundaries, and understanding that walking away from toxic family isn't failure, but an act of profound self-preservation. Lindsay's story teaches us that invisible labor deserves recognition, that financial support without emotional respect is exploitation, and that sometimes the people who should love us most are simply incapable of doing so in healthy ways. Her transformation from the dismissed daughter to the founder of Grace Haven shows us that our worth isn't determined by those who diminish us, but by what we choose to build from the wreckage of their attempts to break us. The preserved mop hanging in Grace Haven's entrance isn't just a symbol of one woman's triumph over humiliation. It represents every person who's been told they're not enough, every daughter who sacrificed for ungrateful parents, every family member who gave everything and received nothing but criticism in return. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you experienced something similar in your own family? Have you been the invisible supporter, the one who gave endlessly while being taken for granted? Or perhaps you've witnessed this dynamic in someone else's life and didn't know how to help. Share your story in the comments below, because your experience matters and might help someone else realize they're not alone in their struggle. What did you think about Lindsay's decision to expose her family publicly? Was it justified, or did she go too far? Did Heather's eventual transformation feel genuine to you, or do you think some betrayals are simply unforgivable? These are complex questions without easy answers, and I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another narrative about resilience, transformation, and the complicated truths about family dynamics. Share this video with someone who might need to hear Lindsay's message that it's okay to choose yourself, even when that choice disappoints people who never truly valued you. Your engagement through likes, comments, and shares helps this channel reach more people who need these stories. Thank you for listening to Lindsay's journey, and remember, you are not what they said you were. You are what you choose to become despite them.